I never planned to spend a night alone in that old cabin. It happened because I wanted a quiet weekend away from work, noise, and everything that kept my head tight. I found the place listed as a simple off-grid cabin deep inside a thick patch of forest. It looked rough but cheap, and at the time that was all I needed. I thought a few days of silence would calm my mind. I had no idea how heavy that silence could get when you are far from anyone who can help you. The road to the cabin was narrow and full of broken branches, and the deeper I drove, the darker the trees became. The branches blocked most of the sky, so even though it was early afternoon, it looked like evening. I could feel the air change the deeper I went. It felt heavier, like the forest was packed tight around me. When I parked the car and stepped outside, the woods swallowed every sound of the engine so fast it left a ringing in my ears. The cabin stood about 100 meters away from the small dirt clearing, made of dark logs that looked older than anything around them. The windows were small and cloudy. I remember the smell of damp wood hitting me the moment I opened the crooked door. Inside, it was nothing but a small room with a tiny kitchen space to the left, a bed on the right, and an old wooden table pushed against the wall opposite the door. Everything smelled like moisture and dust. There was a small generator behind the cabin, but the listing warned that it was weak and only meant for a single light bulb or charging a phone. I didn't care. I wasn't there for comfort. I just dropped my bags on the floor, opened a window to let some fresh air in, and tried to settle into the feeling of being alone. At first, it felt peaceful. The woods were thick, but the air was cool and fresh. I walked around the area a little, just exploring. The forest floor was soft, covered with damp leaves, and the trees stood so close it felt like the forest didn't want anyone walking through it. But I forced myself to relax. I had come for isolation. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. When evening arrived, the forest turned into a wall of black. I didn't expect it to get that dark. The cabin window only showed a reflection of the inside after the sun went down. I cooked something simple on a small stove I brought with me, then sat on the edge of the bed trying to read a book. But I couldn't stop listening to things. The woods made constant tiny sounds. Leaves falling, branches shifting, wind sliding through gaps. These were normal noises, I told myself. But every time one sound stopped, another would start somewhere else, and the cabin vibrations would change just enough to remind me that I was far from anyone. I tried to sleep early, but sleep didn't come easily. The mattress felt thin and cold, and the cabin walls made soft cracking sounds like they were adjusting to the cold night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from the single weak bulb stretch and shrink whenever the generator sputtered. I kept telling myself it was fine, but something in me stayed alert. Then, sometime past midnight, I noticed something different. A new sound. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that it cut through every other noise. It came from outside the cabin, maybe to the left side, near the small window. It was the sound of something pressing lightly against the ground. Not a branch falling, not wind. It was steady, controlled, like weight shifting on soil. I stayed completely still. My breathing grew shallow without me trying. I listened harder. After a few seconds, it came again. A slow, heavy step, then another. Each step seemed spaced out, like the thing moving didn't want to be heard. I felt the muscles in my stomach tighten, and a hot feeling rose through my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone to be anywhere near that cabin. It was rented as a private, isolated place. The nearest house was several kilometers away, and the steps weren't the quick, light movements of an animal. These sounded large and cautious. The steps moved closer to the cabin wall. I could feel the ground outside shift just slightly, almost like the soil pressed inward. My heartbeat got so loud I thought whoever was out there might hear it. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare turn off the light. I just lay flat and stared at the window, watching the shadows around it. At one point, I thought I saw something pass in front of the glass, but the window was too clouded to tell. Then everything went silent, completely silent, the kind of silence that feels intentional. I didn't hear steps leaving. I didn't hear branches crack. It was like whatever had been there stopped right beside the cabin wall and stayed still. I must have stayed awake until morning, barely blinking. When the weak daylight finally pushed into the cabin, I felt the pressure lift slightly. I slowly got up and approached the window. Outside, the forest looked normal. But when I stepped out and circled around the left side of the cabin, I found the ground disturbed. There were prints in the dirt, deep ones. They were too long and wide to belong to any animal common in that area. They looked like footprints of a boot, but bigger than any I had ever seen. And there were only two clear ones, as if someone had stepped close to the cabin and then backed away into heavier ground where the soil wouldn't hold shape. I packed my things immediately. I didn't waste time eating or sitting or trying to understand it. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt like it was hiding something, watching something. But the worst part came when I reached my car. The driver's side door had dirt smudged on it, smeared in a long vertical line, almost like someone had dragged their hand across the metal. The spot was high up, higher than where my own hand would reach normally. That was the moment my fear turned into something hard and sharp. Someone had walked around the cabin at night, had stood beside it, had stepped up to my car, and had touched it. Someone who moved quietly and slowly, like they knew how to approach without being heard. I started the engine fast and drove out of the forest without looking back. The trees felt like they were closing in as I drove, and I kept checking the mirror even though I didn't see anything. When I reached the main road and saw empty open space again, I felt like I could finally breathe. I never reported it. I couldn't explain it in a way that didn't sound ridiculous. Maybe someone was living out there in the woods, far from society. Maybe they watched every outsider who came close. Maybe they saw me arrive and spent the evening waiting for the right moment to come close. I don't know. All I know is that nothing about that night felt accidental. Since then, I haven't gone near any isolated cabins. I don't care how cheap or peaceful they sound, because I can still hear those slow, heavy steps in my head, moving in the dark, taking their time, getting close enough to press their weight into the soil right outside the window. And the clearest thing about that night is that whoever was walking outside wasn't lost, wasn't confused, and wasn't afraid. They knew exactly where I was. They knew I was alone, and they moved like they had all the time in the world. I had taken the trip to the old cabin because I wanted silence. My head had been filled for months with noise from work, traffic, the city, and the constant buzz of people everywhere. The cabin sat deep inside a forest I barely remembered from childhood, a place my uncle once used for hunting. I had not seen it in years, but I remembered parts of the long dirt road leading to it, the faded wooden sign half swallowed by vines, and the narrow trail where branches reached out like arms and scraped the sides of any car trying to pass. By the time I got there, the sky was already turning a dull gray. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, almost like the trees had pushed closer over the years and squeezed it from every side. The wood on the outside had gone dark from weather, and the steps leading to the door felt soft under my boots, as if they had soaked too much rain and were now giving up. The air smelled like wet dirt, pine sap, and something like old metal. Inside, everything was still. There was dust on the floor, a thin layer that made my steps leave clear tracks behind me. The old table my uncle once used for cleaning tools was still against the wall, and a single chair rested beside it. A pile of chopped firewood sat in a corner, the logs gray and dry, like they had been there for years. The cabin only had one small window, and even that window was half blocked by branches from a nearby tree. The dim light that squeezed through made everything look like it belonged in someone else's memory, not mine. I spent the first hour unpacking and trying to get comfortable. The silence was heavy, but it was the kind of silence I thought I had wanted. There were no cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of anything man-made. Just wind sliding through the trees and the occasional sound of something moving through the fallen leaves outside. I told myself it was just animals. Rabbits, maybe deer, nothing unusual. That first night, I tried to sleep early. The mattress in the small wooden bed was harder than I expected, and the blankets smelled like old fabric that had not been washed in years. Still, I forced myself to settle. But the forest did not sleep the way I expected. Every small noise was louder in the darkness. Branches snapped often, too often for me to relax. The cabin walls were thin, and I could feel every shift of the wind pressing against them. I lay still, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself that everything I heard was normal. Hours passed like that. My eyes kept opening even when I tried to keep them shut. At some point, I noticed something strange. The sounds outside were not random anymore. They seemed to follow a pattern, like something was circling the cabin very slowly. The crunching of leaves would fade, then shift to the other side, then fade again, then return behind the cabin. I stayed completely still, listening to every movement. The steps were heavy, heavier than any deer I had ever heard. Something large was walking around out there. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it smelled the food I brought. I didn't move from the bed, but every muscle in my body felt tight, like the air inside the cabin had thickened and was pressing down on my chest. The circling stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I walked outside to see if anything had been disturbed. The ground was soft from the night's moisture, and I could clearly see tracks in the mud and leaves. They weren't bear tracks. They were boot prints, deep, wide, and fresh. They circled the cabin completely, then disappeared into the woods behind it. My stomach felt cold when I saw them. Someone had been out here last night walking around my cabin, slowly, like they were studying it. The nearest town was miles away, and the road was almost impossible to find unless you already knew where to look. No one should have been out here. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone who camped nearby. But the prints bothered me. The way they went in a full circle around the cabin felt deliberate. I kept stepping back to look at them, following the pattern again and again. Whoever it was had walked right past the door, stopped near the window, then continued around. I spent the whole day checking the edges of the forest, listening, trying to spot anything. The longer I stayed, the more I felt watched. Every time the wind moved the branches, I looked up fast, expecting to see someone standing between the trees. No one was there, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, staring at the window. The forest outside was too dark, like the trees swallowed the moonlight before it could reach the ground. Hours passed. Nothing happened. My body started to loosen up a little, and I felt myself drifting. Then the sound returned. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin, just like the night before. I stopped breathing for a moment. The steps moved with the same pattern, the same pace, like whoever it was had memorized the exact shape of the cabin. My hands shook slightly as I pressed myself harder against the wall. At one point, the steps paused right outside the window. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing. So close I felt it more than I heard it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. It was hard to tell. Then the steps continued, finishing the circle before fading into the distance. I stayed awake until daylight. When morning came, I grabbed my things fast. I didn't even bother folding anything or packing neatly. I stepped outside only long enough to lock the cabin door, even though I knew the lock would not stop anyone determined enough. As I walked toward my car, my eyes kept jumping to every tree, every shadow. When I looked down at the wet ground, I saw new boot prints. They were the same as yesterday, but this time they went from the back of the cabin to the front door and stopped right at the steps, right where I had stood the day before. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the night and stood there, facing the door. That was enough for me. I drove away fast, faster than was safe on that narrow forest road. I didn't stop until the trees were far behind me and the noise of the city returned. Later that week, I decided to check something. I searched online for hikers or hunters in that area, but nothing came up. The forest near the cabin hadn't been used for years. There were no campsites, no trails, nothing. The only reason to be in those woods was to find that cabin. And that meant whoever had circled it twice didn't get there by accident. I never went back. And every time I think of those boot prints, perfectly placed around the cabin, I feel the same cold weight in my stomach, because I know one thing clearly now. Someone knew I was there. Someone watched me. Someone waited in the dark, walking circles around the cabin while I tried to sleep inside it. And if I had stayed one more night, I'm not sure that person would have kept walking. They might have stopped at the door. They might have tried the handle. And they might not have walked away. I never planned on spending a night alone in that old cabin. It happened because I wanted a break from everything for a few days. Work had been eating my head. My phone wouldn't stop ringing, and I just wanted silence. A friend had once told me about a small rental cabin deep in the woods near a lake, far from any town. It was cheap, a little run down but quiet. That was all I cared about when I booked it. The drive out there already felt strange. The farther I went, the fewer houses I saw, and the road kept getting thinner until it was just a narrow path surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sky. My car felt tiny between those dark trunks. There was no signal, no sound except my engine and the wind hitting the windows. By the time I reached the cabin, I felt like I had stepped into a place that people stopped visiting a long time ago. The cabin sat a little off the road, almost hidden under the heavy branches of old pine trees. The wood on the outside was worn and dark, like it had been soaked by years of rain. The front steps sagged under my weight. When I opened the door, the inside smelled like cold wood and dust, but it felt safe enough. There was a small kitchen, a little living area with a wood stove, and a bedroom with a single bed pushed against the wall. Nothing fancy, nothing welcoming, but nothing scary either. I unpacked and tried to settle in, thinking the worst thing I'd face would be boredom. On the first day, everything seemed normal. I took a walk around the lake, cooked a simple meal, stacked some firewood, and tried to let my mind relax. But as night got closer, I noticed how fast the light disappeared between the trees. One moment it was late afternoon, and then suddenly everything went gray. The forest went silent too, like something had pressed a button and stopped all sound. I remember standing by the window as the darkness swallowed the yard, feeling a strange heaviness that didn't make sense. I tried to shrug it off. I sat in the cabin that night reading, but every small noise made me look up. The wind hit the walls in short, angry bursts, and the trees rubbed against each other with a slow, dragging sound that felt too close. The wood stove popped now and then, and each time my heart jumped. I kept telling myself it was all normal, just part of being alone far from everything. But there was something about the silence between the noises that bothered me. When I finally tried to sleep, I kept waking up every hour. Sometimes it felt like the cabin shifted slightly, like something heavy was leaning on one side. Sometimes I heard a soft scrape somewhere outside. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see something standing out there, but I never saw anything. I barely slept the whole night. By morning, I convinced myself it was only nerves. I made coffee, stepped outside to get fresh air, and tried to reset my mind. But the yard had new marks in the dirt. Long, uneven lines like something had been dragged near the tree line. I crouched to look at them, thinking maybe a deer had passed through, but the marks didn't look like hooves or paws. They looked like something hard had been pulled through the dirt. I told myself it could have been anything, maybe an old branch blown down in the wind, but I couldn't stop staring at those tracks. I tried to spend the day normal, but I kept feeling watched. Every time I turned my back to the woods, I felt pressure between my shoulders, the kind that makes you turn around even when you know you won't see anything. The shadows between the trees felt thicker, darker. I stayed close to the cabin most of the day, pretending to clean or organize things just to stay busy. But a part of me already wanted to leave. By the second night, the fear settled in my chest before it even got dark. I tried to make the cabin warmer, thinking maybe the cold was making me jumpy. I sat by the stove listening to the crackling wood. For a moment, it actually felt peaceful. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard something on the porch. It wasn't footsteps. It was slower than that. A slow press, then wood bending under weight, then another press. Like something large was shifting its weight from one spot to another. I froze. I held my breath and listened. The cabin walls felt thin. Every small sound traveled through them like vibrations through paper. Then the sound stopped, but I could feel something lingering out there. The air felt thick, like the cabin was holding its breath with me. I waited almost an hour before building the courage to move. I didn't go to the door. I didn't look out the window. I just sat there, completely still, feeling sweat run down my back even though the cabin was cold. When the sound didn't return, I climbed into bed, but I didn't turn off the light. I didn't sleep at all. Every shift of the cabin, every creak, every gust of wind felt like it came from right beside me. When morning came, I walked outside and saw fresh marks on the porch. The boards had dense, deep ones like something heavy had pressed into them. The dragged lines in the dirt were back too, only closer to the cabin this time. The trees on the edge of the yard had pieces of bark peeled off, long strips missing like something had scraped against them with force. Every sign pointed to something real, something alive, something large. But I never saw it. I knew then I had to leave. I packed so fast I barely checked if I forgot anything. But as I loaded the car, I felt eyes on me again. The woods felt like they were holding something just behind the first row of trees. Something I couldn't see but that could see me perfectly. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I got in my car and drove down that narrow dirt road without stopping. The strange part is that nothing chased me. Nothing followed. But even as I left the woods behind, even as the trees thinned and the sky opened up, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me didn't need to follow. It already knew me. It had stood close enough to hear me breathe while I slept. It had walked around the cabin, touched the walls, pressed its weight onto the porch, left marks like warnings. When I finally reached the main road and saw another car for the first time in days, I felt tears in my eyes, the kind you get when your body finally stops holding in fear. By the time I reached home, the whole trip felt unreal, like something my mind had made up. But a week later, when I went through my backpack, I found dirt on the inside. Not normal dirt. Thick, dark soil mixed with small pieces of torn bark, the same color and texture as the trees outside that cabin. I hadn't opened that pocket once while I was there. I still don't know what moved around that cabin, what watched me from the trees, or what dragged itself so close to the porch in the middle of the night. But I know it was real, and I know that if I had stepped outside at the wrong moment, whatever it was would have shown itself, not as a ghost or some storybook monster, but as something living, breathing, and interested in me in a way that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. I didn't go back. I never will. And sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and the wind hits the walls the same way it hit that cabin, I feel the same heavy pressure behind me, the same silent attention. I tell myself it's just memory, just leftover fear. But sometimes I'm not so sure. I never planned to spend a night alone in that cabin. It happened by accident, or maybe because I kept telling myself I could handle things on my own. I had driven deep into the forest that weekend to get away from noise, work, people, and everything that felt heavy. I found an old cabin on a rental site that looked simple but safe. The listing said it was quiet, isolated, and perfect for a weekend of rest. At the time, that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't think about how isolation can turn into something else when night comes and you have no one around. The road to the cabin was rough and narrow. Trees leaned over the path like they were trying to hide it. Branches scraped the sides of my car, and the deeper I went, the more my phone signal dropped until it finally died completely. When I reached the cabin, it looked older than the pictures. The wood was darker, the windows were dusty, and the porch steps sagged slightly when I walked on them. Still, it seemed strong enough. I wasn't worried. I told myself old cabins always look like that. Inside, everything smelled like cold wood and dust that had been sitting untouched for months. The living room had a small fireplace, a wooden table, and one old chair that looked like it had been used by many people before me. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a window that faced the forest. There was no electricity except for a small solar battery that powered one weak bulb in the living room. There was no running water. The listing had warned me, but seeing the dry sink made it feel more real. I spent the first hour settling in. I stacked some firewood near the fireplace, placed my backpack in the corner, and checked every part of the cabin to understand the layout. The silence outside felt thick, There were no cars, no people, and not even many birds. Just the wind pushing through the tall trees. I kept telling myself it was perfect for resting, but a small part of me felt uneasy, like I had stepped too far away from the world. By late afternoon, the forest felt heavier. The light changed to a deep orange, and long shadows stretched across the ground. I walked a little around the cabin to look at the clearing. The forest around it was dense, with no clear trails. It looked like a place where you could get lost easily if you walked too far without thinking. I stayed close because I knew I was the only one out there and there was no quick help if something went wrong. When it started getting dark, I went inside and locked the front door. The lock was old and a bit loose, but it clicked into place. I made a small fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound helped fill the silence. I ate something simple from my backpack and tried to relax. For a while it worked. The warmth from the fire made the cabin feel less empty. But after the sun disappeared completely, everything changed. The forest went silent in a way that didn't feel natural. I could hear nothing but the fire inside the cabin. Even though I was alone, I felt like something outside was aware of me. It wasn't anything supernatural or strange. It was more like the feeling you get when you know someone is watching from behind you, even if you don't hear them. Around that time, I heard the first sound. It was faint and slow, a soft crunch of leaves, like someone stepping on the forest floor. I froze and listened. The sound stopped, then started again, this time a little closer. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the trees, but the steps were too slow, too careful, spaced apart like they belonged to someone who didn't want to be heard. I moved closer to the window, but I didn't stand directly in front of it. I stayed slightly back and looked through the gap in the curtain. The darkness outside felt thick, and my eyes struggled to adjust. For a moment I saw nothing. Then I noticed something near the tree line. Something faint and small, like a shadow moving between the trunks. I couldn't make out its shape, but it wasn't an animal. It moved too smoothly, too upright. I stepped away from the window. My heartbeat felt heavier, louder, almost painful. I didn't want to panic yet, so I sat on the floor near the fireplace and tried to think. Could have been a hiker, a hunter, or someone passing by. The forest was big. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. But the listing had been clear. No neighbors for miles. The steps came again. This time they were closer, slow, almost cautious. I held my breath. I didn't move. Then everything went silent again. The kind of silence that makes you feel like someone stopped moving only because they reached the place they wanted to be. I stayed near the fireplace for what felt like a long time. My eyes kept returning to the door, expecting the handle to move. The fire started dying, and the room dimmed. I didn't want to get up to add more wood, but I had to. The darkness made me feel exposed. As I placed more wood on the fire, I heard another sound, this time on the porch. A light, careful step on the old wood outside the front door. The cabin creaked softly under the weight. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the weight of a person. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I moved slowly to the side of the door and stood with my back against the wall, trying not to breathe too loudly. The steps on the porch were slow, almost testing the boards. Then they stopped right in front of the door. I waited for a knock, but none came. Instead, I heard the soft scrape of fingers or something touching the door near the handle. Not turning it, just feeling it, testing it, pressing against it to check how strong it was. The old wood made a faint sound as pressure was put on it. The lock rattled a little. I stayed silent, waiting. After a few seconds, the pressure on the door stopped. The steps moved slowly back across the porch, then faded into the forest again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat against the wall with my flashlight on, facing the door until the sky outside slowly turned gray. The first light of morning felt like a rescue. As soon as the forest was bright enough, I grabbed my backpack, opened the door, and stepped outside. The air felt cold and sharp. On the porch, I saw the clear imprint of a shoe in the dust, large, deep, not mine. The shoe was angled toward the door, like someone had stood there for a long time. I didn't waste a second. I got in my car and started driving back down the rough forest road. I looked in the rearview mirror only once. and the cabin stood there small and silent, surrounded by trees that looked even taller in the morning light. When I reached a town far from the forest, my phone signal returned, and the world felt normal again. But I knew someone had been in those woods that night. Someone who moved slowly, carefully, and came close to the cabin without saying a word. What stays with me is not the sound of the steps or the pressure on the door. It's the thought that whoever it was watched the cabin long before I heard them. They had probably seen me arrive. They had probably waited until dark. They had probably planned to see if the cabin was empty or if I was asleep. I left that place behind, but the thought that someone was wandering those woods, silently, slowly, watching for any sign of weakness, has never left me. And I know for a fact that if I had drifted off, even for a second, the sound I woke up to might not have been footsteps on the porch, but the old cabin door finally giving in. That is why I never go to isolated cabins anymore, no matter how peaceful they look in pictures. Peace is only peace when you know no one else is in the trees watching, waiting for darkness to come. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin. It was supposed to be a simple day of exploring the woods, taking a break from work, and clearing my mind. I hadn't slept well for weeks, and the noise of the city felt like it was crawling under my skin. I just wanted quiet. I drove out to an area I had never visited before, a large forest with long dirt roads that twisted deep between tall trees. The air smelled clean, and the sky looked pale and empty, almost like it was warning me about something. I parked near a narrow trail and walked for a long time, moving deeper until I didn't hear anything except wind touching the branches. The weather started to shift as the day went on. Gray clouds came in fast, and the temperature dropped a little more every minute. I thought about heading back to the car, but I didn't want to rush. I kept walking until I found something I didn't expect to see. It was an old cabin sitting alone between thick pine trees. The wood looked dark and dry, like it had been there for years without anyone touching it. The windows were covered with dirt. One of them had a crack running across the glass from corner to corner. The place didn't look alive in any way. It looked abandoned, forgotten, almost sinking into the forest ground. I felt uneasy right away, but the cold wind kept rising, and the sky warned me that rain wasn't far. I walked around the cabin first, trying to understand why it was there. There were broken pieces of wood lying behind it, some old footprints in the dirt that had lost their shape, and a metal bucket tipped over near the door. The more I looked at it, the more it felt like someone had left suddenly, not carefully. I didn't want to stay outside in the storm, so I pushed the door slowly and stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and old dust. The floor creaked under my weight, and the walls felt close even though the cabin wasn't small. There was a single bed pushed into the corner, a table with scratches all over it, and a shelf with a few things left behind. An empty glass bottle, a rusted old knife, and a piece of cloth folded into a small square. There was no electricity, no running water, nothing modern in it. Whoever had used this place had lived very simply. I didn't plan to stay long, just long enough for the rain to pass. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the wind push against the walls. The storm arrived quickly. The rain slapped the roof hard, like handfuls of small stones. The cabin shook a little each time the wind hit it. The air grew colder inside, and I started to regret not heading back earlier. As the storm grew louder, I started to hear things that didn't sound like wind or rain. They were faint at first, small sounds mixed with the storm. I tried to ignore them, but after a while they became too clear to pretend they were nothing. It sounded like someone walking outside, very slow steps sinking into the wet ground. They stopped for a long time, then continued again. They were circling around the cabin. At first I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving between the trees. But the steps were too steady, too careful, too deliberate. Animals don't move like that, especially not in heavy rain. The steps paused sometimes right outside the walls, as if whoever was out there was standing still, listening, thinking. I felt a tight pressure grow in my chest. My breathing changed without me noticing. I moved slowly to the window and looked out. but the glass was so dirty and the rain so heavy that I couldn't see anything beyond the blurry shapes of trees. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, always slow, always with long pauses, almost like whoever was out there didn't want to be heard. When the steps reached the front door, I froze. The door gave off a soft sound, like someone touching it gently, not pushing, not trying to break in, just touching it, testing the wood, maybe checking if anyone was inside. I stayed perfectly still on the bed, trying to make my breathing as quiet as possible. My skin felt hot even in the cold air. The person, because by then I was sure it was a person, moved away again. I heard the steps fade into the distance behind the cabin. I didn't dare move for several minutes. The storm kept roaring outside, but the quiet between the steps had left a deeper kind of silence inside the cabin. A silence that felt alive. Hours passed slowly. I stayed awake the whole time, sitting on the bed, listening for any new sound. The storm kept going, and the temperature kept dropping. I wrapped myself in the old piece of cloth from the shelf. It smelled strange, but it helped against the cold. Every now and then I thought I heard movement far away in the woods, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was doing it. It wasn't until after midnight that the storm finally started to weaken. The wind slowed down, and the rain became lighter. I waited even longer, giving the forest enough time to settle. When I felt sure the outside was quiet, I walked to the door and opened it slowly. The cold air hit me first. Then I saw the ground. Fresh footprints were pressed deep into the mud. They were human. They went around the cabin exactly the way I had heard them. Slow circles, long pauses. Some were right by the door, facing it directly. The prints led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a strong wave of fear move through me. Someone had walked around that cabin for almost an hour while I was inside, and they never tried to talk, never knocked, never called out. They just watched the cabin and moved around it over and over again. I didn't bother waiting for the sun. I grabbed my things and left immediately, following my memory of the trail. The forest felt heavier than before, like the trees were all leaning in. I kept looking behind me, imagining someone standing far back between the trunks. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. My clothes were wet, my hands were shaking, and my throat felt dry. I drove away with the heater turned all the way up, but the cold from the cabin stayed in me until long after sunrise. Later, when I thought about what happened, the scariest part wasn't the footsteps. It was the fact that whoever was out there never tried to force their way in. They didn't run, didn't shout, didn't rush. They walked like they had all the time in the world. They were patient, too patient, and they knew I was inside. I don't go exploring alone anymore. I don't care how peaceful the woods look. There are things out there that are not supernatural, not strange in any magical way. They're just people. People who move quietly, people who watch, people who wait. And the worst part is that you don't hear them until they want you to. That night taught me something clear and simple. The scariest thing in the woods isn't the dark, the animals, or the weather. It's the person you never see, the one who stands quietly in the rain, circling a lonely cabin, hoping you make a mistake. I spent the whole drive up into the hills trying to relax, telling myself this little trip would clear my head, but the higher the road climbed, the more uneasy I felt. The cabin I rented sat deep inside a quiet patch of forest where the trees grew so thick they blocked most of the sky. I picked the place because it was cheap, far from people, and looked simple. I wanted a break from noise. I thought silence would help me think. I didn't think about how heavy silence can feel when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. The cabin looked older than it did in the pictures. The wood was dry and dark, like it had been soaking in cold air for decades. When I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Old dust, damp wood, and something else I couldn't place. It wasn't a rotting smell, but it had that kind of weight to it, like something had been sealed up too long. The place had one room, one small kitchen area, and a bathroom that felt colder than everything else. The windows were narrow, almost useless, and the trees pressed so close to the walls that the cabin hardly got any natural light. I placed my bag on the small bed and looked around. There was nothing personal inside, no decorations, no photos, no books. It felt empty in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the cabin didn't want anyone living in it. The first night started fine. I made something simple to eat, walked around outside for a few minutes, and listened to the forest. The deeper the night got, the louder the woods became. Branches snapped even when there was no wind. Something heavy moved through the leaves every few minutes. At first I told myself it was normal. Forests have animals and I was the outsider here. But when I lay down and turned off the light, I realized how thin the cabin walls really were. Every sound outside came through them like the walls were made of paper. I tried to sleep but kept listening without meaning to, hearing things move, stop, then move again. I stayed awake until morning without even realizing it. The next day, I walked farther into the woods, trying to see if there were any signs of animals near the cabin. The ground was soft from old leaves, and in some spots I saw prints that looked like deer. But near the cabin, the ground showed something different. The leaves were pushed down in long, uneven lines, like something had been dragging itself or dragging something else. The marks circled around the cabin more than once. I stood there staring at them, feeling my stomach twist because I didn't remember seeing anything like that the day before. I went inside and tried not to think about it. I kept myself busy, sweeping the floor, organizing my things, anything to quiet my mind. But the feeling stayed with me, that sense of being watched. It was like the cabin held its breath with me. That night, things felt worse. The noises outside didn't sound random anymore. They sounded slow and deliberate, like something was checking the cabin step by step. I tried to keep my breathing steady. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, telling myself it was all in my head. But then I heard something hit the wall. Not hard, but enough to make me freeze. Then another tap a little higher up. Then another one lower, close to the ground. It felt like something was testing the walls, tapping different spots, trying to understand what was inside. I lay there for what felt like hours, but it might have been minutes. I didn't move at all. At some point, the tapping stopped, replaced by slow crunching footsteps moving around the cabin, circling it the same way the dragged marks had. When the sounds moved toward the back of the cabin, I got up quietly, grabbed the small flashlight from my bag, and stood there in the dark, holding my breath. The crunching footsteps stayed in the same spot for a long time, right behind the wall where the bathroom was. I didn't sleep that night either. By morning, my nerves were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee mug. I told myself I would stay one more night, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I didn't want to run away over sounds I couldn't even explain. But the day didn't help. Every time I stepped outside, the woods felt different. The air felt still, heavy, like everything was watching me from deep inside the trees. I didn't hear birds. I didn't hear anything except an occasional snap far away. I kept glancing over my shoulder even when I didn't hear anything. It was as if the whole forest had gone quiet to listen to me instead. By sunset, my anxiety was so bad that I sat inside with the flashlight beside me long before it got dark. I didn't light the cabin lamps because I didn't want anything outside to see light through the windows. I sat in the dark, waiting, listening. The silence thickened as the night grew. Then the noises started again. At first, it was the same slow steps through the leaves, climbing from far away toward the cabin. The steps stopped at the same spot as the night before, behind the bathroom wall. I sat still, barely breathing. The cabin felt so small around me, like the walls were shrinking. Then the tapping started again. Soft taps against the wood, moving around the wall, just like before, like fingers searching for weak spots. But this time it didn't stop there. The tapping moved along the wall toward the window. My chest tightened as I stared at the dark glass, waiting, knowing something stood inches away on the other side. The tapping changed to a slow dragging, as if something pressed against the window frame and slid across it. The glass made a faint vibration, just enough for me to hear it in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and my flashlight, slipped to the door as quietly as I could, and stepped outside. I didn't look toward the woods. I ran straight to my car. The air outside was cold and sharp, and the forest felt alive behind me, waiting for me to look back. When I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up, and finally got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove without looking in the mirrors. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, and I kept driving until I reached the main road. I didn't stop until I got home. The next morning, I checked the cabin's rental listing out of curiosity. The post was gone. When I tried to find the owner's profile, it was gone too. No trace of the place existed anywhere, like it had been pulled off the map overnight. I don't know what was moving around that cabin. I don't know what circled it or why it tapped on the walls like it was trying to study who was inside. But I know this. Something lived in those woods, something that wasn't afraid of getting close. And if I had stayed even one more night, I don't think I would have left that place at all. That cabin is somewhere out there, hidden in those trees. And whatever was exploring the walls that night is probably still walking circles around it, waiting for the next person to step inside and try to sleep. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the road turned from cracked asphalt into rough dirt, the kind that made the whole truck shake like it wanted to fall apart. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods because I thought a few quiet days alone would help me clear my head. I'd been feeling stuck in my life, like every day was the same, and I wanted to get away from everything familiar. The listing showed a simple wooden cabin beside a narrow lake, nothing fancy, but the photos looked peaceful. It was supposed to be completely isolated. At the time, that sounded perfect. By the time I actually reached it, the isolation felt heavier than I expected. The cabin was smaller than the pictures made it seem. The wood on the outside looked old and dark, almost black in some places, as if rain and time had eaten through layers of paint. The air around it felt unusually still. No wind, no bird sounds, not even water movement from the lake a few steps away. It was a strange kind of quiet that made my ears ring. Inside, the cabin had only the basics. A bed with a thin mattress, a table with two mismatched chairs, a small counter with an old gas stove, and a heavy metal wood stove in the corner. The place smelled like damp wood and cold dust that had been sitting untouched for months. I placed my bag on the bed and walked around, trying to get used to the silence. The floorboards groaned under every step, and there were long scratches on them, not deep, but noticeable enough that I kept looking at them every time I walked across. I spent the first evening trying to settle in. I swept the floor, wiped the table, and checked the windows. Everything felt slightly off, like things had been moved around by someone who didn't care much. The back window had a small crack in the corner, and the lock felt loose. I made a mental note to push the table against it later, just to be safe. When night came, darkness fell fast. There were no streetlights, no nearby cabins, not even a distant glow from any town, just blackness. I lit a small lamp that flickered a bit, making shadows jump around the walls. The sounds inside the cabin became sharper, the faint tapping of branches against the roof, the creaking of the old stove metal cooling down after I lit a fire, and the soft hum of the night outside. I tried to sleep, but the mattress felt uneven, and the wooden frame made a low groan every time I shifted. I kept listening to the woods without meaning to. At first, it was just normal forest sounds, an occasional crack of a branch, the distant movement of something small. But after a couple of hours, the noises changed. They became slower, heavier. Something moving through the trees, and not small. Something stepping carefully, pausing often. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear, but the sounds felt too controlled, like whatever it was moved with intention. I lay completely still, trying to hold my breath so I could listen better. The sound came closer. I could hear the soft crush of dead leaves, then nothing, then another soft step. It reached the area behind the cabin. The thin walls felt like they did nothing to protect me. My heartbeat grew loud enough that I felt it in my throat. I waited for the sound of something sniffing or scratching, but instead there was only the slow pressure of weight shifting outside, like someone or something was standing still just a few feet away from the wall. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, afraid to even blink. I kept waiting for it to move again, but the stillness lasted so long that eventually I started to doubt if I heard anything at all. After what felt like an hour, exhaustion pulled me into a light and uneasy sleep. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was covered with damp leaves, and most of it looked untouched. But on the side of the cabin where I had heard the sounds, there was a patch where the leaves had been pushed aside, leaving darker, fresh soil showing. It wasn't a clear footprint, but there was a shape like something heavy had stood there. I tried telling myself it was an animal, but something about the size and the way the leaves were moved didn't sit right with me. The rest of the day, I tried distracting myself. I went down to the lake and looked across the calm water. It was narrow and long, stretching deep into the tree line, disappearing around a bend. The water was so still it looked like a sheet of dark glass. I kept feeling like someone was standing behind me, watching me, but every time I turned, there was nothing but the trees. Inside the cabin, I noticed more things I hadn't seen before. On one of the windowsills, there were tiny wood splinters, like something had been picked at or scratched. The door frame had a faint mark near the hinges, almost like pressure had been applied there. Nothing obvious enough to call damage, but things that didn't feel like regular wear. As night came again, I felt myself growing tense before the darkness even settled. I built a strong fire in the wood stove and checked the windows twice. The silence outside felt heavier than the night before. When I finally got into bed, I kept my eyes open for as long as I could, staring at the door, the corners, the edges of the room where shadows piled up. It didn't take long for the noises to start again. Slow, steady movement through the trees. My chest tightened. The steps stopped near the same spot as before. Couldn't move. I felt my arms go cold, and my breathing grew shallow. Then I heard something I hadn't heard the night before. A soft shift of weight against the side of the cabin, like something leaning closer, testing the wall. I could almost feel the pressure through the wooden boards, the faint change in sound as the weight settled. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed and pointed it at the window even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. I didn't dare get up. I stayed frozen until the sound eventually faded, slow steps moving away, disappearing into the distance. When morning came and I stepped outside again, the patch of disturbed leaves from the night before had grown larger. Whatever it was had stood there again, maybe longer this time. I walked back inside with a tight feeling in my stomach. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The cabin didn't feel like a peaceful escape anymore. It felt like a place where something watched me every minute after the sun went down. I packed quickly, barely stopping to make sure I didn't forget anything. When I closed the cabin door for the last time, I felt a deep, steady relief. I didn't look back at the trees or the lake. I just started my truck and drove away, trying not to think about the soft steps I had heard or the weight leaning against the wall. By the time I reached the main road, the woods felt like they were finally releasing me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and I didn't report anything. There was nothing clear to report anyway, but I knew what I heard. I knew something had been out there, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to stand and wait in the dark. Ever since that trip, I've avoided staying anywhere remote. I still think about the cabin sometimes, about the quiet that didn't feel natural, about the marks and the disturbed leaves. But what stays with me most is the thought that whatever was out there had moved with purpose, not confusion. Like it was waiting for something, or someone, and I was alone in that cabin, with nothing but thin wooden walls between us. I drove up to the mountains late in the afternoon, the road turning narrower and rougher as the trees grew taller and the light grew weaker. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend alone. I wanted silence. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the endless pressure of work, from the notifications that never stopped. I didn't know how isolated the place really was until I saw it. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt trail that almost looked forgotten. The boards on the porch gray and rough, the windows a bit fogged from age. The air felt colder around it even though the sun hadn't fully gone down yet. I carried my bags inside and felt how stale the air was. It smelled like old wood, dust, and damp clothes that had dried slowly. The cabin had only one main room with a small kitchen on one side, a narrow bathroom, and a bedroom in the back with a single window. The silence inside was heavier than outside, like the walls were blocking the wind but trapping something else. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, stacking my food on the counter, filling the old kettle with water, and walking around the small space to get used to it. As evening settled, everything outside turned dark much faster than I expected. The trees around the clearing blocked a lot of the sky, so only a thin strip of fading light remained overhead. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold hit my face sharply, and the air smelled like wet soil and pine. I stood there for a long moment, listening. There were the usual forest sounds: wind pushing branches, something small moving through leaves, the creaking of wood, but nothing strange. Still, I felt like I needed to keep looking over my shoulder. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned on the single lamp beside the couch. Its light was yellow and weak, leaving the corners of the room dim. I heated some soup and ate while listening to the stove tick as it cooled. After that, I tried to read, but the silence kept breaking my focus. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that made small noises seem louder. Every crack in the wood floor, every shift in the beams above me, every gust of wind hitting the wall made my body tense. Around midnight, I decided to sleep. The bedroom felt colder than the rest of the cabin. The window looked straight out into the forest, and even though I closed the curtains, I could still feel the darkness pressing against the glass. I lay down and pulled the blankets tight, trying to slow my breathing. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but it wasn't deep sleep. It was the kind where every sound slips into your dreams and twists them. I woke suddenly sometime in the early hours. I didn't know why at first. I just felt alert, like something had changed around me. The air in the room felt sharper, like someone had let cold night air in. I stayed still and listened. First, it was quiet. Then, I heard something light, slow steps on the wooden porch outside, the kind of sound made by a person trying not to be heard. The weight of each step was too heavy for an animal that moved carefully. I froze. I listened harder, my breath held. The steps moved across the porch boards, slowly, as if someone was taking their time. I could picture the old wood bending under someone's weight. Then the steps stopped right outside the front door. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt it in my throat. The door didn't open. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then there was another sound, something brushing softly against the wall near the door. A faint dragging sound, like a hand or something solid being slid along the wood. I waited for what felt like forever. The noise stopped. The porch stayed silent for a long time. Eventually, after minutes that felt like hours, I heard the faintest crunch of leaves. A single step moving away from the cabin. Then another. Then the sound faded deeper into the woods. I stayed awake until the first light crept into the sky. The moment I felt safe enough to move, I got up and checked the door. It was still locked. I looked out the window slowly, pushing the curtain just enough to see outside. The porch looked normal, but there were marks on the railing, long smudges of something dark, maybe dirt or mud. They weren't natural. They were the kind of lines made by fingers or gloves dragged slowly across the wood. I told myself someone must have been lost, maybe a hunter or hiker passing through. But the way they moved didn't feel like someone asking for help. It felt like someone studying the cabin, checking it, testing if they could get inside. I spent that whole day inside, keeping the curtains shut and staying away from the windows. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, organizing, anything to keep busy. But every noise outside made me tense again. I kept feeling watched, even though I didn't see anything through the cracks in the curtains. When evening came again, the fear grew worse. I didn't want to stay another night, but the nearest town was far, and there was no cell phone signal anywhere near the cabin. Leaving in the dark on those narrow mountain roads didn't feel safe either. I decided to wait until morning no matter what. The second night felt longer. I stayed in the living room instead of the bedroom, keeping the lamp on. The light flickered sometimes because the wiring was old. I sat on the couch with my sleeping bag wrapped around me, listening so hard that my ears began to ring. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The wind outside grew stronger, shaking the branches and making them scrape against the roof. I kept telling myself that if something was going to happen, it would have happened already. Around maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, when the lamp's glow was starting to hurt my eyes, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, just a single sound, something hitting the side of the cabin, hard enough that the wall vibrated slightly. I felt the couch shake under me, then silence. Thick, heavy silence. Then something moved outside again. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin on the crunchy ground. The steps kept going, pausing at each window. I could hear each stop clearly, the leaves compressing under weight, the faint creak of someone leaning their weight against the wall. They were checking the windows one by one, moving around the entire cabin. I didn't move an inch, couldn't even breathe right. I kept my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the handle to turn. The steps circled twice, then everything went still again. The woods went so quiet it felt unnatural. That silence lasted until dawn. The moment sunlight touched the trees, I grabbed my bags, threw everything into the car, and didn't even look around the cabin again. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw new marks on the walls, fresh smears of mud and 2 clear dents near the window frame like someone had pressed something hard against it. I didn't stop to study them. I didn't want to know more. I drove nonstop for hours until I reached the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone because I knew there was nothing they could do. Whoever had been out there wasn't trying to break in loudly. They were patient, careful, someone who didn't want to be seen or heard. Someone who watched the cabin long enough to know when I moved and when I slept. I haven't gone back to any cabin since then. Every time I think about it, I can still feel the cold air of that first night waking me up, and I can still hear those slow steps on the porch. Whoever that person was, they didn't go there by accident. And the way they circled the cabin made it clear they weren't lost. They were waiting for the right moment, and if I had slept even a little deeper or ignored the noises, I believe they would have found it. Getting out of there in the morning wasn't just the end of the trip. It was the moment I realized how close I had been to something real and dangerous, something fully human, and something willing to stand outside a stranger's cabin in the dark for hours. I left that place untouched behind me, but the feeling of being watched, checked, and measured has never fully gone away. I reached the cabin just before the sun dipped behind the trees, and the moment I stepped out of my car, the cold air hit me harder than I expected. The place was deeper in the woods than I remembered from the pictures online. The dirt road that led me here was narrow and uneven, with long branches dragging across the sides of my car like something trying to grab on. I booked the cabin because I thought it would be a simple break from everything, no calls, no work, no people. I wanted peace, but the moment I stood there staring at the dark wooden structure hidden behind tall pine trees, something in me felt unsure, like I already regretted it but couldn't explain why. The cabin looked old but still standing strong. The wood had dark stains from years of rain and wind. The windows reflected the trees like mirrors. There were no other cabins around, not even a hint of one. Just endless woods stretching out in every direction. I tried to calm myself by taking a deep breath, telling myself I was just tired from the long drive. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old firewood. The air felt trapped, as if nobody had opened the place in months. I dragged my bags inside and started looking around. There was a small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen with metal counters that felt colder than the air, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom. Everything looked untouched, nothing out of place, but the silence made it all feel wrong. It was the kind of silence that didn't just sit in the room, it pressed against your ears. After settling in, I stepped outside again to breathe. The trees around the cabin were tall and dense, blocking most of the sky. Even the small patch of open ground in front of the cabin felt tight, as if the forest wanted to swallow it back up. I stood there listening, expecting to hear birds or the wind moving through the branches. Instead, I heard something else, something faint, almost like the sound of leaves shifting under slow, careful steps. It wasn't close enough for me to see anything, but it wasn't far either. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, The woods had plenty of them, and animals moved all the time. But something about the rhythm of those steps felt deliberate, not random. As the light faded, the woods became one dark shape, and I went back inside. I locked the door even though the area was supposed to be safe. I made something simple to eat and sat on the couch trying to relax. But the cabin had this strange way of making every little noise stand out. The tick of the old wall clock sounded louder than it should have. The faint groaning of the wooden floorboards felt like footsteps even when I wasn't moving. And every now and then, I'd hear short, sharp taps on the outside wall, like something hitting it lightly. At first, I thought it was just branches or pine cones falling, but the taps were spaced too evenly. One, then a pause, then another, always on a different part of the wall. I tried to ignore it, but my body stayed tense, waiting for the next sound. Even breathing felt heavy. By the time it was completely dark, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I walked through the cabin checking every window. The glass was old and cloudy, making it hard to see outside. When I looked out toward the trees, all I saw was blackness. Not the normal kind of dark. This was the kind that swallowed everything. I turned away quickly because staring at that darkness made my skin crawl. I decided to go to bed early, even though I wasn't tired. I just wanted the night to pass. The bedroom felt colder than the rest of the cabin. The mattress was thin, and the blanket smelled like it had been stored for a long time. I lay there with my eyes open, listening to the same distant rustling sounds from earlier, except now they felt closer. The taps on the wall came again. Same slow pattern, moving around the cabin like someone circling it. My breathing got faster even though I tried to keep still. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my chest felt tight. I wanted to look outside, but my body refused to move. I knew I wouldn't see anything anyway. It was too dark. Hours passed. The taps stopped at some point, but the silence felt even worse. I kept imagining someone standing just outside the window watching the cabin. The thought got stuck in my head until it felt real. Couldn't sleep. I lay there waiting, listening, staring at the wooden ceiling. Sometime after midnight, I heard something new. Slow steps on the front porch. Not light like an animal. Heavy. Controlled. The boards of the porch creaked under each step. My heart thudded so hard I thought the sound would echo in the room. Then the doorknob moved. Not rattled wildly. Just a slow, testing turn like someone checking if it was locked. I froze completely, barely breathing. The knob turned once, then again, then stopped. I waited for a knock or another attempt, but nothing came. Just silence. I lay there for an hour, maybe more, unsure if the person had left or was still standing there. The fear made time feel stretched and twisted. Eventually, the first pale light of morning showed through the thin curtains. I got up and walked to the front door. My hands were shaking. When I opened it, the cold morning air rushed in. The porch was empty, but there were footprints, clear prints in the dirt leading up to the door. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. The prints were large, deep, and spaced in a way that told me the person was tall. They didn't go back toward the trail or the road. They went around the cabin toward the trees. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. The prints continued into the woods, and once they reached the shadows of the trees, they blended with the ground and disappeared. I felt watched again, the same crawling feeling from the night before. I didn't care about my bags or the food I brought. I rushed inside, grabbed my car keys, and left everything else behind. The drive out of the woods felt endless. Every time I looked in the mirror, I expected to see someone standing on the road behind me. When I finally reached the main paved road, I didn't stop. I kept driving until I saw houses, people, anything that wasn't trees. I never went back for my things. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't want to talk about it with anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the footprints leading into the woods, disappearing into the dark. Someone was out there watching the cabin. Someone who didn't need to break in. Someone who only wanted to see how close they could get. And the worst part is the thought that keeps coming back no matter how much I try to push it away. The feeling that they weren't just passing by. They knew I was alone. They knew I was new to the place. And judging by the slow, careful way they moved, They were in no hurry at all. They wanted to come back, and maybe if I hadn't locked the door, they would have. I drove up into the hills late in the afternoon because I wanted a quiet place to clear my head, and the small wooden cabin I rented online looked perfect. It sat alone in a thick forest, far from the main road, and the dirt path leading to it was narrow enough that branches scraped the sides of my car. By the time I reached the cabin, the air felt damp and cool, and the smell of wet leaves filled my nose. I remember feeling relieved to finally step outside and stretch my legs after the long drive. The cabin looked old but strong, with dark wood boards and a small porch that sagged a little in the middle. There were no other houses around, only tall trees and thick brush that made everything feel closed in. Inside, it was simple. One room with a bed pushed up against the corner, a small kitchen area, and an old heater that clicked every few seconds. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I walked around. The windows were small and had thin curtains that barely covered them. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, thinking I would spend the night reading, maybe walking around the woods in the morning. I felt safe enough. The silence felt almost calming, but the quiet started to change as the light faded. It wasn't a strong sound, just small snaps from the woods, like twigs breaking. I told myself it was animals. There were probably deer, maybe rabbits. The forest was thick, so sounds bounced around strangely. The heater kept clicking and tapping, and the roof popped every so often as the temperature dropped. All normal things, but for some reason, every sound made me stop what I was doing and listen. I made myself some food and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach. When I stepped outside to throw away some trash, the air felt heavier, like the darkness pushed against my skin. The trees looked almost black, and the narrow path I drove in on was now nothing but a dark tunnel. I went back inside faster than I meant to, shutting the door harder than necessary. I tried to calm myself, but even then, I felt like the woods were watching me. Later in the night, around the time I wanted to sleep, I heard something new. It wasn't a twig snapping or an animal moving through leaves. It was slower, more controlled. Something brushing against the outer wall of the cabin. The wood made a dull sound, almost like a hand dragging along it. I froze on the bed, my heart beat quick and loud in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but there was no wind. The trees were still. The air was dead quiet except for that slow, steady drag against the wall. I sat completely still, trying to breathe quietly. The noise went around the corner of the cabin, and then it stopped. The silence that followed felt even worse. I waited for a long time, staring at the thin curtains over the windows, afraid to go near them. The heater kept clicking, and each tiny sound made me jump. Eventually the dragging noise came back, but this time it was softer, like whatever was outside was trying to be careful. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, waiting. Hours passed like that. At some point, something touched the front door. Not a knock, more like a slow pressure, as if someone leaned against it. I stared at the door, watching the small shadow under it, expecting to see movement. Nothing happened for a long time. Then one sharp sound hit the door, just once. A single hard tap. It echoed through the whole room. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a metal flashlight, and held it tight. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, and I didn't want to get close to the windows. The thin curtains felt useless, and I imagined a face pressed against the glass, watching from the dark. The heater clicked. The roof creaked. My own breathing felt too loud. When the soft footsteps started moving around the cabin again, I felt sick. They were slow and heavy enough that I knew it wasn't a small animal. The way they circled the place made it even worse, like someone walking in loops, thinking, waiting. Each step on the dead leaves outside was clear. Crunch, pause, crunch, another pause. It went on for so long that I lost track of time. I just sat on the bed gripping the flashlight, my whole body stiff. Around early morning, when the sky started to lighten a little, the footsteps moved farther away. I waited until the forest turned gray instead of black before I finally stood up. My legs felt weak, The air inside the cabin was stale and cold, and I realized I had barely moved all night. I forced myself to go to the door, and when I opened it, the cold morning air hit my face, and for a moment I felt dizzy. The ground outside showed clear marks in the soft dirt, deep footprints circling the entire cabin, some close enough that whoever made them had stood right under the windows. I followed them slowly with my eyes, and the prints led toward the trees, disappearing into the thick brush. They were human footprints, large, heavier than mine, and far too close to the cabin for comfort. I backed up and went inside, shutting the door. I didn't pack anything neatly. I just shoved my things into my bag and grabbed my keys. The cabin felt smaller with every second that passed. The silence outside felt wrong, like someone was still out there watching but holding still. When I stepped outside to get to my car, I felt something on the back of my neck, like eyes on me. The forest was wide and quiet, but the shadows between the trees looked deeper than before. I didn't look around. I just got into my car, started the engine, and drove down the narrow dirt path. My hands shook on the steering wheel. Every time I passed a dark patch between the trees, I expected something to move, but nothing did. When I finally reached the main road, the weight on my chest eased just a little, but I didn't stop driving. I didn't even look in the mirror. When I reached home hours later, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to make sense of the night. There were no ghosts, no strange creatures, just someone out there walking around my cabin in the dark, circling it, pressing on the door, dragging a hand across the wall, standing under the windows. Someone who never tried to break in, never spoke, never made a sound except those slow steps. The ending was clear in my mind even before I unpacked. I would never go back to any place that isolated again. I learned something real that night. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't anything supernatural. Sometimes it's just another person in the dark, someone you can't see, someone who doesn't need to break in or say a word to make you understand that you're not as alone as you think. And that knowledge stayed with me. It still does. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the road turned from cracked asphalt into rough dirt, the kind that made the whole truck shake like it wanted to fall apart. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods because I thought a few quiet days alone would help me clear my head. I'd been feeling stuck in my life, like every day was the same, and I wanted to get away from everything familiar. The listing showed a simple wooden cabin beside a narrow lake, nothing fancy, but the photos looked peaceful. It was supposed to be completely isolated. At the time, that sounded perfect. By the time I actually reached it, the isolation felt heavier than I expected. The cabin was smaller than the pictures made it seem. The wood on the outside looked old and dark, almost black in some places, as if rain and time had eaten through layers of paint. The air around it felt unusually still. No wind, no bird sounds, not even water movement from the lake a few steps away. It was a strange kind of quiet that made my ears ring. Inside, the cabin had only the basics: a bed with a thin mattress, a table with two mismatched chairs, a small counter with an old gas stove, and a heavy metal wood stove in the corner. The place smelled like damp wood and cold dust that had been sitting untouched for months. I placed my bag on the bed and walked around, trying to get used to the silence. The floorboards groaned under every step, and there were long scratches on them, not deep, but noticeable enough that I kept looking at them every time I walked across. I spent the first evening trying to settle in. I swept the floor, wiped the table, and checked the windows. Everything felt slightly off, like things had been moved around by someone who didn't care much. The back window had a small crack in the corner, and the lock felt loose. I made a mental note to push the table against it later, just to be safe. When night came, darkness fell fast. There were no streetlights, no nearby cabins, not even a distant glow from any town, just blackness. I lit a small lamp that flickered a bit, making shadows jump around the walls. The sounds inside the cabin became sharper: the faint tapping of branches against the roof, the creaking of the old stove metal cooling down after I lit a fire, and the soft hum of the night outside. I tried to sleep, but the mattress felt uneven, and the wooden frame made a low groan every time I shifted. I kept listening to the woods without meaning to. At first, it was just normal forest sounds, an occasional crack of a branch, the distant movement of something small. But after a couple of hours, the noises changed. They became slower, heavier. Something moving through the trees, and not small. Something stepping carefully, pausing often. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear, but the sounds felt too controlled, like whatever it was moved with intention. I lay completely still, trying to hold my breath so I could listen better. The sound came closer. I could hear the soft crush of dead leaves, then nothing, then another soft step. It reached the area behind the cabin. The thin walls felt like they did nothing to protect me. My heartbeat grew loud enough that I felt it in my throat. I waited for the sound of something sniffing or scratching, but instead there was only the slow pressure of weight shifting outside, like someone or something was standing still just a few feet away from the wall. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, afraid to even blink. I kept waiting for it to move again, but the stillness lasted so long that eventually I started to doubt if I heard anything at all. After what felt like an hour, exhaustion pulled me into a light and uneasy sleep. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was covered with damp leaves, and most of it looked untouched. But on the side of the cabin where I had heard the sounds, there was a patch where the leaves had been pushed aside, leaving darker, fresh soil showing. It wasn't a clear footprint, but there was a shape like something heavy had stood there. I tried telling myself it was an animal, but something about the size and the way the leaves were moved didn't sit right with me. The rest of the day, I tried distracting myself. I went down to the lake and looked across the calm water. It was narrow and long, stretching deep into the tree line, disappearing around a bend. The water was so still it looked like a sheet of dark glass. I kept feeling like someone was standing behind me, watching me, but every time I turned, there was nothing but the trees. Inside the cabin, I noticed more things I hadn't seen before. On one of the window sills, there were tiny wood splinters, like something had been picked at or scratched. The door frame had a faint mark near the hinges, almost like pressure had been applied there. Nothing obvious enough to call damage, but things that didn't feel like regular wear. As night came again, I felt myself growing tense before the darkness even settled. I built a strong fire in the wood stove and checked the windows twice. The silence outside felt heavier than the night before. When I finally got into bed, I kept my eyes open for as long as I could, staring at the door, the corners, the edges of the room where shadows piled up. It didn't take long for the noises to start again. Slow, steady movement through the trees. My chest tightened. The steps stopped near the same spot as before. I couldn't move. I felt my arms go cold, and my breathing grew shallow. Then I heard something I hadn't heard the night before. A soft shift of weight against the side of the cabin, like something leaning closer, testing the wall. I could almost feel the pressure through the wooden boards, the faint change in sound as the weight settled. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed and pointed it at the window even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. I didn't dare get up. I stayed frozen until the sound eventually faded, slow steps moving away, disappearing into the distance. When morning came and I stepped outside again, the patch of disturbed leaves from the night before had grown larger. Whatever it was had stood there again, maybe longer this time. I walked back inside with a tight feeling in my stomach. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The cabin didn't feel like a peaceful escape anymore. It felt like a place where something watched me every minute after the sun went down. I packed quickly, barely stopping to make sure I didn't forget anything. When I closed the cabin door for the last time, I felt a deep, steady relief. I didn't look back at the trees or the lake. I just started my truck and drove away, trying not to think about the soft steps I had heard or the weight leaning against the wall. By the time I reached the main road, the woods felt like they were finally releasing me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and I didn't report anything. There was nothing clear to report anyway, but I knew what I heard. I knew something had been out there, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to stand and wait in the dark. Ever since that trip, I've avoided staying anywhere remote. I still think about the cabin sometimes, about the quiet that didn't feel natural, about the marks and the disturbed leaves. But what stays with me most is the thought that whatever was out there had moved with purpose, not confusion. Like it was waiting for something, or someone, and I was alone in that cabin, with nothing but thin wooden walls between us. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin. I only wanted a quiet weekend away from people, somewhere I could think and breathe without cars and screens and the same routines. I had driven far into the mountains, farther than I should have, until the dirt road turned so narrow that tree branches scraped along both sides of my car. I kept going because the air felt clean and cold, and I thought I would find a small clearing to set up camp. But the road ended suddenly at a tiny open area with an old cabin sitting a few steps back from the tree line. The cabin looked abandoned. The wood was dark and worn, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. One window was broken at the corner. A metal chimney rose from the roof, covered in rust. There were no signs of recent use, no tracks, no fresh footprints, nothing. I didn't want to camp in the open clearing because the wind was already pushing through the trees in long, cold waves, and the temperature was dropping fast. The cabin at least had walls and a roof. I told myself it would only be for a night. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and dust. The floor creaked under every step, but it felt solid enough. There was a small table pushed against one wall, a rusted stove in the corner, and a narrow bed frame with no mattress. The cabin looked like it had been empty for years. The only strange thing was a single chair placed right in the middle of the room, facing the door. It bothered me for a moment, but I convinced myself someone might have left it that way while packing up long ago. When the sun began to set, the cabin got darker faster than I expected. The trees around it blocked most of the fading light, and without electricity the room fell into deep shadows. I set my small lantern on the table and lit it. The soft yellow glow pushed the darkness back only a little. The walls seemed to close in when the light hit them, and the chair in the middle threw a long thin shadow that stretched across the floor like an arm reaching for the door. I tried to relax. I heated a small can of food on my stove, ate quickly, and kept telling myself it was just a normal empty cabin in the woods. Nothing more, but I could feel something off about it, something that made my stomach stay tight. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was more about the silence. The woods were never this quiet at night. I had camped many times, and there were always noises. Crickets, wind, snapping branches, animals. Here, the silence was heavy. It felt like the air was holding its breath. I lay down on my sleeping bag on the wooden floor, close to the wall where it was a little warmer. The lantern flickered from time to time, and every flicker made the shadows jump, as if something moved in the corners. I kept my eyes half open, watching the chair in the middle of the room. For some reason, I didn't like looking away from it. It felt too exposed, too perfectly placed, like someone always needed to sit there. Hours passed slowly. Couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing small sounds, not outside but inside. Soft shifts like wood settling, but more spaced out than normal creaks. It sounded like weight being put down very gently somewhere on the floor. Every time I lifted my head and looked around, nothing had changed. The chair was still in the same place, my bag still beside me, everything quiet again. Sometime after midnight, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The chair wasn't in the exact same spot I remembered. It wasn't a big difference, just slightly angled now, as if turned a few centimeters. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I had bumped it earlier or if the floor's unevenness had shifted it. I told myself that must be it, but my body stayed tense like it didn't believe my own explanation. I forced myself to lie down again, but I didn't close my eyes. The lantern kept dimming slowly as the fuel ran low, and each time the room darkened, the chair looked like it was leaning a little more toward my direction. Maybe it was my imagination, but it looked wrong. The shadow grew thicker and clearer, stretching toward my sleeping bag. At some point, the lantern died completely. The darkness that filled the cabin was thick and absolute. I could not see anything at all. I could only hear the soft wind outside and my own breathing. But after a minute, I heard something else. Something so faint that if the cabin wasn't so quiet, I never would have noticed. It was the soft scrape of wood against wood. Slow, careful, like something being dragged a few inches. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I tried to tell myself it was just the old floor shifting again. But then I heard it a second time, a tiny scrape, closer than before. My heart hammered so loud I thought whatever was making the sound would hear it. I stayed frozen on the floor, staring into the dark that hid everything from me. When the sound came a third time, I finally reacted. I reached slowly for my flashlight, trying not to make any noise. My hand shook badly when I pressed the switch. The beam shot across the room, shaky and narrow. It hit the far wall, then the stove, then the table, and finally the middle of the cabin. The chair was now only a few feet from where I lay. It had been moved. Not a little, not by a gust of wind or uneven flooring, but dragged across the room, straight toward me. I felt a rush of cold run through my whole body. My mouth went dry. I shined the flashlight around again, searching for footprints, animals, anything. There was nothing, just dust on the floor and long drag marks from where the chair had slid. I realized then that the silence outside wasn't natural. It wasn't just the woods holding still. Something was out there, something that had moved the chair, maybe many times before I noticed. It wasn't ghostly or magical. It was real, something human, someone who must have been waiting in the dark when I arrived. Someone who had probably watched me through the broken corner of the window. Someone who knew this cabin better than I did. My fear shifted into survival. I grabbed my bag, my lantern, and kept the flashlight pointed at the door while backing away from the chair. The drag marks showed it had been pulled in a straight line. Someone had moved it recently, maybe minutes before I turned on the light. They were probably still nearby, maybe inside the cabin earlier, maybe hiding right outside in the dark waiting for the lantern to die. I didn't care about packing everything. I didn't care about noise anymore. I ran out of the cabin and straight to my car, shining the flashlight wildly on the trees as I moved. The woods felt alive again, not with animals, but with the sense of eyes watching me from every direction. The cold air cut into my lungs as I sprinted to the car, fumbling with the keys, forcing myself not to look behind me. When I finally got the engine started, the headlights lit the front of the cabin for a second, just long enough to see the open door and the empty doorway. I couldn't tell if anyone was standing just out of sight, but the shadows around the entrance looked wrong, thicker than the rest. I drove away so fast I nearly slid off the road more than once. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and even then I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The mountains behind me were pitch black. No cabins, no lights, no shapes I could make out. Just darkness swallowing everything. The next morning, I thought about going back to look in daylight, to see if anyone had been staying there. But something in me refused. I already knew the truth. Someone had been inside that cabin long before I arrived. Someone had moved the chair over and over, maybe testing how close they could get before I noticed. Someone had waited for the darkness to hide their movements. The ending was simple and clear. I had walked into the wrong cabin at the wrong time. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was just being used by a person who didn't want to be found. And that person had been only a few feet from me in the dark, moving slowly, patiently, as if waiting to decide what to do next. I never went back to those mountains again, and I never will. There are things in the woods more dangerous than anything supernatural. Things that watch, wait, and step quietly across old wooden floors. And sometimes the scariest part is knowing they are real. I didn't plan to spend the night in that cabin. It was supposed to be a simple day of exploring the woods, taking a break from work, and clearing my mind. I hadn't slept well for weeks, and the noise of the city felt like it was crawling under my skin. I just wanted quiet. I drove out to an area I had never visited before, a large forest with long dirt roads that twisted deep between tall trees. The air smelled clean, and the sky looked pale and empty, almost like it was warning me about something. I parked near a narrow trail and walked for a long time, moving deeper until I didn't hear anything except wind touching the branches. The weather started to shift as the day went on. Gray clouds came in fast, and the temperature dropped a little more every minute. I thought about heading back to the car, but I didn't want to rush. I kept walking until I found something I didn't expect to see. It was an old cabin sitting alone between thick pine trees. The wood looked dark and dry, like it had been there for years without anyone touching it. The windows were covered with dirt. One of them had a crack running across the glass from corner to corner. The place didn't look alive in any way. It looked abandoned, forgotten, almost sinking into the forest ground. I felt uneasy right away, but the cold wind kept rising, and the sky warned me that rain wasn't far. I walked around the cabin first, trying to understand why it was there. There were broken pieces of wood lying behind it, some old footprints in the dirt that had lost their shape, and a metal bucket tipped over near the door. The more I looked at it, the more it felt like someone had left suddenly, not carefully. I didn't want to stay outside in the storm, so I pushed the door slowly and stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and old dust. The floor creaked under my weight, and the walls felt close even though the cabin wasn't small. There was a single bed pushed into the corner, a table with scratches all over it, and a shelf with a few things left behind. An empty glass bottle, a rusted old knife, and a piece of cloth folded into a small square. There was no electricity, no running water, nothing modern in it. Whoever had used this place had lived very simply. I didn't plan to stay long, just long enough for the rain to pass. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the wind push against the walls. The storm arrived quickly. The rain slapped the roof hard, like handfuls of small stones. The cabin shook a little each time the wind hit it. The air grew colder inside, and I started to regret not heading back earlier. As the storm grew louder, I started to hear things that didn't sound like wind or rain. They were faint at first, small sounds mixed with the storm. I tried to ignore them, but after a while they became too clear to pretend they were nothing. It sounded like someone walking outside, very slow steps sinking into the wet ground. They stopped for a long time, then continued again. They were circling around the cabin. At first I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving between the trees. But the steps were too steady, too careful, too deliberate. Animals don't move like that, especially not in heavy rain. The steps paused sometimes right outside the walls, as if whoever was out there was standing still, listening, thinking. I felt a tight pressure grow in my chest. My breathing changed without me noticing. I moved slowly to the window and looked out, but the glass was so dirty and the rain so heavy that I couldn't see anything beyond the blurry shapes of trees. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, always slow, always with long pauses, almost like whoever was out there didn't want to be heard. When the steps reached the front door, I froze. The door gave off a soft sound, like someone touching it gently, not pushing, not trying to break in, just touching it, testing the wood, maybe checking if anyone was inside. I stayed perfectly still on the bed, trying to make my breathing as quiet as possible. My skin felt hot even in the cold air. The person, because by then I was sure it was a person, moved away again. I heard the steps fade into the distance behind the cabin. I didn't dare move for several minutes. The storm kept roaring outside, but the quiet between the steps had left a deeper kind of silence inside the cabin. A silence that felt alive. Hours passed slowly. I stayed awake the whole time, sitting on the bed, listening for any new sound. The storm kept going, and the temperature kept dropping. I wrapped myself in the old piece of cloth from the shelf. It smelled strange, but it helped against the cold. Every now and then I thought I heard movement far away in the woods, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was doing it. It wasn't until after midnight that the storm finally started to weaken. The wind slowed down, and the rain became lighter. I waited even longer, giving the forest enough time to settle. When I felt sure the outside was quiet, I walked to the door and opened it slowly. The cold air hit me first. Then I saw the ground. Fresh footprints were pressed deep into the mud. They were human. They went around the cabin exactly the way I had heard them. Slow circles, long pauses. Some were right by the door, facing it directly. The prints led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a strong wave of fear move through me. Someone had walked around that cabin for almost an hour while I was inside, and they never tried to talk, never knocked, never called out. They just watched the cabin and moved around it over and over again. I didn't bother waiting for the sun. I grabbed my things and left immediately, following my memory of the trail. The forest felt heavier than before, like the trees were all leaning in. I kept looking behind me, imagining someone standing far back between the trunks. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. My clothes were wet, my hands were shaking, and my throat felt dry. I drove away with the heater turned all the way up, but the cold from the cabin stayed in me until long after sunrise. Later, when I thought about what happened, the scariest part wasn't the footsteps. It was the fact that whoever was out there never tried to force their way in. They didn't run, didn't shout, didn't rush. They walked like they had all the time in the world. They were patient, too patient, and they knew I was inside. I don't go exploring alone anymore. I don't care how peaceful the woods look. There are things out there that are not supernatural, not strange in any magical way. They're just people. People who move quietly, people who watch, people who wait. And the worst part is that you don't hear them until they want you to. That night taught me something clear and simple. The scariest thing in the woods isn't the dark, the animals, or the weather. It's the person you never see, the one who stands quietly in the rain, circling a lonely cabin, hoping you make a mistake. I drove up to the cabin because I thought I needed a break from everything around me. Work had been getting heavier, and I felt like I could not breathe in my own house anymore. The cabin belonged to someone I knew, and he told me it would stay empty all winter. I thought the isolation would help me clear my head, so I packed food, clothes, a small toolbox, my old camera, and a few blankets. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, when the sun was already sliding behind the tall trees. The place was exactly how I remembered it from years ago. A small wooden structure, one floor, a narrow porch, a metal chimney, and a thick line of pine trees closing it in on all sides. The air felt colder than it should have been for that time of the year. I stepped inside and smelled dry wood, old dust, and something faint that I could not place at first. It was like damp clothing that had been left somewhere too long. The floor creaked under every step. The cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a heavy wooden door to the bathroom. I opened the windows to let fresh air inside, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. As the light faded, I unpacked my things and placed them in neat stacks because it helped me feel calm. Outside, the forest grew darker faster than the sky, like the trees themselves swallowed the last bit of daylight. I set up my small lamp and tried to warm the room with the old heater. It worked, but the sound of the metal ticking made the quiet even heavier. After cooking a simple meal, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. The first strange thing happened when I went outside to bring in more firewood. I heard a short, sharp crack from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't an animal sound. It was like a piece of wood snapping under pressure, but cleaner, more controlled. I told myself it could be a fallen branch or maybe a deer stepping on something. The cold pushed me back inside quickly. Before sleeping, I locked the door and placed my bag near the bed, using it as a small barrier. I didn't know why I did that. Maybe it made me feel safer. I woke up in the middle of the night because of a faint sound. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to pull me out of sleep. It sounded like something touching the outer wall of the cabin. Slow and dragging, as if someone brushed a long piece of fabric or rope along the wood. I held my breath without thinking. The heater had gone completely silent, so the room felt too still. The only sound was that dragging noise, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I stayed frozen under the blanket until it stopped. Even then, I didn't move. I waited a long time before falling asleep again. The next morning, the forest looked normal. Birds moved between branches, and the cold air felt fresh. But when I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd near the back wall. A thin scratch line ran across the wood, almost the entire width of the cabin. It was too straight to be an animal, too smooth. It looked like something hard. Maybe metal had been pulled across it. I stood there for a while, staring at it, feeling something heavy settle inside me. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I took photos of the trees, the frozen ground, and the narrow path leading back to the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near the cabin during the night. I kept looking over my shoulder while walking. Every sound felt too close, like something moved just out of sight. I left the camera on the porch railing when I came back inside and tried to ignore the growing tension building in my chest. When night came again, the fear grew worse. The forest looked darker than before, like the trees had moved in closer. The heater made new ticking sounds that didn't match the rhythm from the night before. I tried to read something on my phone, but the battery was low, and the weak signal drained it fast. When it finally died, I was left in the dim light of the lamp and the faint glow from outside. I was lying in bed when it began again. This time it wasn't a dragging sound. It was a soft thud against the wall. Then another. Slow, spaced-out hits like someone pressing their palm or their fist gently against the wood. It started near the back wall and moved toward the front of the cabin. My body tightened as I listened. My eyes locked on the dark ceiling. The hits reached the wall near the bed and then stopped. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for something else, but the night stayed quiet after that. In the morning, I forced myself to go outside again, even though I didn't want to. The same line from yesterday was still there, but now there were 3 small dents in the wood, spaced evenly apart, as if someone had pushed their knuckles or a tool against it. I looked around slowly. The ground had patches of disturbed soil, but the frost made footprints impossible to read. I couldn't tell if they were from animals or something else. By noon, I made up my mind to leave the next morning. I told myself I would pack at sunrise and drive home, no matter what. I didn't want to stay another night, but it was already too late to try the road in the dark, and the cabin was the only shelter around. That final night was the worst. I barely turned off the lamp before I heard something outside. It sounded like quiet steps, careful and slow, circling the cabin. My heart hammered so hard that it hurt. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening as the steps stopped and started again. Always moving, always searching. At one point, something pressed against the front door. Not enough to open it, but enough to make the wood groan lightly. I sat completely still, afraid any movement would give away my location inside the cabin. The steps continued for what felt like an hour before they finally faded into the distance. When dawn came, I didn't waste a second. I packed everything as fast as I could and threw it into my car. Before getting in, I looked at the cabin one last time. On the front door, near the handle, was a single long scratch. Fresh, sharp, and deep. Someone had tried something during the night. Maybe testing the door. Maybe testing my reaction. I drove away without looking back again. The road felt endless, but every mile away from the cabin made my breathing easier. When I reached the small town far away, I stopped at a gas station and sat in the car for a long time, letting the warmth soak into my hands. The fear still clung to me, but I knew one thing clearly. Whoever had been out there wasn't an animal, and they weren't lost. They moved with purpose. They watched the cabin, tested it, circled it. They wanted to know if someone was inside. The ending became clear to me as I finally pulled onto the highway. If I had stayed one more night, or if I had made a single mistake with the door or the windows, I don't think I would have made it out. The cabin was empty for the winter, and someone out there knew it. They thought it would stay empty. They weren't expecting a visitor. And after those nights, I was sure of one thing. They weren't planning to leave me alive if they ever managed to get inside. I never went back to that place again, and I never will. The cabin is still there, but something else is too, moving through those woods, watching for anyone who might step inside alone. I never planned to spend that weekend alone in a cabin, far from everything, but the idea came to me after a long and tiring month. I wanted silence, cold air, and a place where I could hear myself think. I booked a small wooden cabin deep in the woods. It was the kind of place surrounded by tall trees that blocked the sky, with a thin gravel road that looked like it was never used. When I reached it, the air felt heavy and still, and the silence was so strong that it almost pressed against my ears. I thought that silence would help me relax, but I learned quickly that total silence can feel like a warning. The cabin looked older than the pictures showed. The walls were dark, the wood swollen from years of rain, and the steps creaked under the smallest amount of weight. The smell inside was a mix of dust, old smoke, and something faint that I could not place at first, like damp earth trapped inside the walls. I dropped my bag on the floor and looked around. It had one small bedroom, a kitchen that barely fit one person, and a living area with a wood stove in the center. Thick trees pressed against all sides of the cabin, like the forest was leaning in too close. The first hour was normal. I unpacked, stretched my legs, and walked around the cabin to check everything. But as the sun started to drop, the woods changed. The air grew colder, and the trees outside looked darker, as if they swallowed all remaining light. I kept telling myself that it was normal, that forests always changed at sunset, but something about the way the shadows moved made my stomach tighten. When night settled in, the cabin felt smaller. The stillness outside made every noise inside feel louder. My footsteps sounded heavy. The stove crackled like it was alive. My breathing echoed in the quiet. I tried to relax by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. Every minute or two, I felt like I needed to look at the window, like something would be standing there. Nothing was there, but the feeling didn't fade. Around midnight, I started hearing noises outside. At first, it was just the wind pushing branches, but soon I noticed a pattern. It sounded like slow steps on the gravel road, dragging slightly, stopping, then moving again. I froze and listened. The steps were too steady to be an animal. They had weight like a person walking slowly, as if they were trying not to make noise but failing just a little. My heart started beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I stepped away from the window, keeping my back against the far wall, watching the dark outside. The footsteps stopped, but then I heard something brushing lightly against the cabin wall. It was a soft sound, but long and steady, like fingertips or fabric sliding across wood. I felt a cold wave go through my chest. I looked at the windows, wondering if I should turn off the lights. My brain started working too fast, thinking of every possibility, trying to stay calm but failing. I kept telling myself it could be an animal brushing by, even though the steps didn't match any animal I knew. I waited for the noise to stop, but it didn't. The sound moved slowly along the wall, sliding from one corner of the cabin to the other, pausing now and then like whoever or whatever was outside was checking the structure, tracing it. I held my breath and leaned against the small table in the living area, feeling the wood shake slightly from how tense I was. Minutes passed, maybe longer, then everything went silent again. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I didn't move for a long time. I stared at the front door, at the small lock that suddenly looked weak and useless. I didn't know what to do, so I waited. I waited so long that my legs started to ache from standing still. I finally forced myself to go to the bedroom, but I didn't lie down. I sat on the edge of the bed and kept listening. When the second noise came, it was worse than the first. It came from the back of the cabin, a slow scraping sound against the outer wall, but this time it was higher, around shoulder level. Something was touching the cabin again, moving across it. I felt my skin crawl. I didn't want to get close to any window, but I needed to know if someone was out there. I crouched low and looked from a distance, trying to see through the small gap in the curtain without revealing myself. The darkness outside was thick, but I could see a faint shape between the trees. Stood still, too still, like it was waiting. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I stepped back and pressed myself against the bedroom wall. I didn't have a weapon. Nothing except a heavy flashlight and a small kitchen knife that was more suited for cutting fruit than defending myself. For hours, the noises came and went. Sometimes scraping, sometimes soft thumps, sometimes footsteps that stopped too close to the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed sitting with the flashlight in my hand, ready to hit anything that came close. When the sky finally began to lighten, the noises stopped completely. As soon as I could see the trees clearly, I made my decision. I packed everything as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly that I kept dropping things. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face and made my nerves feel sharper. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the forest was empty. Still, the ground told me I wasn't imagining things. There were footprints in the gravel. Large ones, human ones. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the door, the back wall. They were deep, like the person had stood there a long time. I felt a shiver run through my whole body. I followed them with my eyes and saw that they led back into the trees, deeper into the forest where the shadows were thick. I didn't wait a second longer. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove down that narrow gravel road faster than I should have. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out onto the road. But no one did. When I reached the main road, I felt my body finally loosen. The world looked normal again. Cars passed, birds flew, but inside me I felt something different, a heaviness. Knowing that someone had walked around that cabin in the middle of the night, watching, listening, touching the walls while I sat alone inside. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner to explain. I just left everything behind, including the idea that silence and isolation could bring peace. Now, when I think about that night, the thing that stays with me the most is how patient those footsteps were. How slow, how careful. Whoever was out there was not lost. They knew exactly where I was. I walked into that old cabin late in the afternoon, carrying the weight of a long week on my shoulders. I had picked the place randomly on a rental site, not because it looked nice, but because it was cheap and far away from everything. That was what I wanted, a silent place where I could breathe for a while. The photos showed a simple wooden structure sitting alone in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. No neighbors, no people, just space. At the time, that sounded peaceful. By the end of the trip, I would regret choosing a place so isolated. The road leading there was narrow and rough, with loose dirt and rocks knocking against the underside of my car. The trees on both sides grew thick and high, leaning over the road like they were trying to close it off. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun was low and orange, sliding behind the thick tree line. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. The wood was old and gray, with long cracks running through the boards. There was a small shed behind it and an empty metal fire pit in front. Everything around it was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. Felt like the clearing was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin smelled like old dust, cold air, and a little bit of damp wood. The floor creaked under every step. There was one bed pushed against the wall, a small table, a metal stove, and a single window facing the woods. The glass was smudged and scratched, making the trees outside look blurred and darker than they were. I dropped my bag on the floor and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling spreading through me. At first, the evening went fine. I made a simple meal on the stove and sat near the window while eating. The light outside faded fast, and soon the clearing turned into a black open space surrounded by even darker woods. I didn't hear birds or wind or anything, just pure, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it and focused on unpacking. It didn't take long before I started hearing things. Soft cracks in the woods, light crunches on the ground like weight shifting slowly from one foot to another. I told myself it was just animals. The place was deep in the forest and animals were normal. But the sounds didn't move around like animals usually do. They didn't rush or wander. They stayed in one place for long stretches of time, then shifted a little, then stopped again. It was as if something was standing just out of sight, waiting. I tried to look outside, but the cabin window barely showed anything except a faint shape of trees. The darkness between them was deep enough that even the moonlight didn't reach all the way down. When I stepped back from the window, I felt a cold wave move down my back. The silence returned thick and heavy, wrapping itself around the whole cabin. I forced myself to get ready for bed, thinking that sleep would reset everything in the morning. But lying in that cabin bed felt like lying in a wooden box with thin walls. I could hear every small noise outside. The shifting steps came back again, slow and steady, like someone testing the ground. A faint scrape dragged across the dirt near the front of the cabin. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stayed perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling, afraid that any movement might make the sounds stop or change. Somehow I knew it was better if I didn't draw attention to myself. Hours passed like that. The sounds would fade, then come back, always closer, always dragging a little longer. I didn't even dare breathe loudly. When the first thin line of morning light showed through the fogged window, I felt my whole body relax. My muscles were stiff, like I had spent the whole night clenched tight. I stepped outside to check around the clearing. I didn't want to, but I needed to know if something had actually been there. The dirt around the cabin looked normal at first, but closer to the treeline I saw something strange. A patch of earth was disturbed in a long, narrow path, like someone had dragged something heavy through it. It went from deep inside the woods to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. Nothing else. No boot prints, no paw prints, just that long, dragged mark. I kept telling myself it could be from an animal pulling something, but the mark was too straight, too controlled, and too wide. It looked like something deliberate. I felt watched even though the daylight made the place appear harmless. The second night was worse. Before the sun fully set, the same creeping silence dropped over the clearing again. No wind, no animal calls, just a smooth curtain of stillness that felt unnatural, even though I didn't allow myself to call it that. I went inside hours before dark, locked the door, and shut the curtains. I tried to keep myself busy, but every sound in the cabin made me jump. I kept sensing movement outside, like something was circling the clearing. When night fully took over, the steps returned. This time they weren't slow or uncertain. They were steady and heavy, like someone walking with purpose. They moved around the cabin, stopping at different points, then shifting again. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, light, but real. A soft thud hit the wall near the window. Not enough to crack anything, but enough to make my blood turn cold. At one point, the steps stopped on the wooden porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I held my breath so long my lungs hurt. My whole body felt frozen. I didn't know if the door would hold. I didn't know if whoever or whatever stood there wanted to come in. I didn't move until the steps slowly left the porch and faded back into the trees. I waited until early morning before daring to move again. When the daylight finally spilled in, I stepped outside once more. The porch had new marks on it. Long, thin scratches running across the old wood, like something had pressed into the boards while shifting its weight. But the door was untouched. Whatever stood there didn't try to enter. It just waited. That was enough for me. I grabbed my stuff fast, barely checking if I had everything. My hands were shaking as I locked the cabin behind me. I didn't look at the treeline, even though I felt something watching from there. I got into my car, turned the engine on, and drove down the dirt road without looking back once. When I reached the highway hours later, surrounded by cars and people and noise, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't imagination. The marks on the ground were real. The weight on the porch was real. And the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left. I will never go back to a place that empty again. Silence like that is not peaceful. It's a warning. And I believe whatever stood outside that cabin was waiting for someone who wouldn't leave as early as I did. I stepped out of my car and felt the cold air sink straight into my skin. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, almost lost between the tall pines and the thick wall of brush pressing in from every side. I picked this place because it was supposed to be quiet, far from the city noise, far from anything that could distract me. I didn't expect how heavy that silence would feel once I stood there alone with nothing but my own footsteps breaking it. The cabin was old, with dark wood that had turned almost black from years of weather. The windows looked cloudy like thin frost even though it wasn't freezing yet. The front steps sagged under my weight. When I pushed the door open, the smell of old wood and cold air hit me. Every surface felt untouched for months, maybe years. I could see my breath inside even though the sun was still up. I unpacked slowly, trying to adjust to the place. The space was small. One main room with a wood stove, a little table, and a single bed pushed into the corner. Every sound I made echoed too loudly. When I walked across the floor, each board complained with a long dragging creak that felt like it followed me. I kept telling myself this was what I came here for. Peace, quiet, time alone. But the quiet felt wrong. Not peaceful. More like the woods outside were holding their breath. I kept glancing at the windows even though nothing moved out there except shadows from the trees. I set up my gear, made a fire in the stove, and tried to settle into the place. As the fire warmed the room, the cabin changed. The walls made small cracking pops, like they were adjusting to the heat. Then the stove began to make a slow, steady ticking sound. It was normal, I knew that, but hearing anything break the silence made me more aware of how alone I was. When the sun went down, the forest turned into a dark shape pressing against the windows. The cabin lights barely pushed back the darkness. I could hear the trees moving, branches rubbing against each other like quiet whispers. Every now and then, something heavier shifted deeper in the woods. Maybe an animal, maybe just wind, but the pattern of the sound made my chest tighten. I forced myself to eat and tried not to stare at the door every time the trees moved outside. After cleaning up, I sat on the bed with my back against the wall. I tried to read, but my eyes kept jumping to the window on my left. Felt like the dark outside was watching me. I hated that thought, but it kept coming back. Later that night, when I finally lay down, I kept the small lamp on. The room felt too open. The windows felt too thin. I listened to the woods the way someone listens to a house when they think they heard something, waiting for another sound, focusing on every tiny movement. The stove had died down, leaving only faint warmth, and the cabin felt like it was cooling way too fast. Sometime after midnight, I heard a noise that didn't sound like the wind or the trees. It was a single, heavy step outside, like a shoe pressing into cold soil or a boot crunching a layer of frost. The hairs on the back of my neck went straight up. I stayed still, focusing on the sound, waiting to hear it again. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the deep quiet of the woods. I tried telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. Then I heard another step, closer. My chest tightened so hard it felt painful. The cabin walls, thin and old, felt useless. I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. The steps stopped right outside the door. I stared at the handle, expecting it to move. My whole body felt frozen and ready to run at the same time. But nothing happened. Whoever or whatever was outside just stood there. Minutes passed so slowly I could feel each one stretch. Eventually, the steps moved away, but not like something wandering off. It sounded like someone circling the cabin. Slow, careful, steady. I didn't move. I stayed in bed with my back pressed to the wall, feeling the rough wood through the blanket. When the steps finally faded into the woods, I stayed awake until the first light of morning touched the trees. I didn't sleep at all. My muscles hurt from staying in the same tense position for so long. When daylight filled the cabin, I stepped outside. My breath fogged in the cold air. The soil around the cabin was soft from yesterday's drizzle, easy to leave marks in. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the prints by the door. Boot prints. Not old ones, not faint ones. Fresh, deep enough to show weight behind them. They weren't mine. They were larger than mine, too. And they led around the cabin exactly the way I heard the steps move last night. I followed them with my eyes, and they stopped at the edge of the trees like whoever made them walked back into the woods. But none of the prints led toward the cabin. Only around it. Only watching. My stomach twisted because that meant someone had been out there long before I arrived. Waiting silently in the dark woods, stepping into view only after I settled inside. I didn't stay for another night. I didn't even go back inside to double-check anything. I grabbed what I could from the car, slammed the door, and drove out of there with shaking hands. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Only then did I breathe normally again. Later, when I thought about it, the part that scared me the most wasn't the steps or the prints or the way they circled the cabin. It was the fact that whoever it was never tried to get inside. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They just walked around slowly, calmly, like they were studying the place, studying me, deciding something in the middle of the night while I lay there frozen. I realized that if they wanted to come in, they would have. Nothing would have stopped them. So they didn't leave because they couldn't get in. They left because they didn't want to. And knowing that was enough to keep me from ever going near a lonely cabin again. I spent the last week trying to understand why I ever thought staying alone in a cabin deep in the woods would be a good idea. When I planned the trip, it sounded simple. I wanted a break from noise, people, and routines. I wanted a few quiet days to clear my head. I didn't expect fear to creep into every part of me or to learn how quickly a place that looks peaceful in daylight can feel like a trap once the sun sets. The cabin was small and old. The wood on the walls was dry and rough, and when I first stepped inside, the air smelled like dust, cold soil, and something faintly metallic. It had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a back door that opened straight into thick, uneven woods. Everything around me felt still. There were no cars, no houses, and no signs of anyone nearby. Just trees packed tightly together, leaning over the cabin like they were trying to hide it. I arrived late in the afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Even the wind felt muted. I walked around inside, trying to get used to the place. The floorboards shifted under my steps, and every small sound I made seemed too loud. I stored my things, checked the windows, and made sure everything locked properly. At that moment, I didn't think much about why I felt the need to double-check the locks. I assumed I was just being careful. I ate a simple meal and decided to step outside before it got completely dark. The cold air hit me hard, stronger than I expected. The trees were tall and thin, their branches twisting together so tightly that the sky almost disappeared behind them. The ground was uneven with roots and rocks sticking out everywhere. I walked only a short distance before I noticed that the woods looked different depending on which way I turned. Everything blended together. A person could get lost easily if they weren't paying attention. When I got back inside, the sky had turned darker than I thought it would. I noticed how the trees cast long, stiff shadows across the ground. It made the cabin look even smaller. I shut the door and locked it again. The air inside felt stale, so I opened a window just a little to let some fresh air in. The smell of dirt and damp leaves drifted inside. The first night went mostly quiet. Mostly. Around midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. It was the kind of waking that felt forced, like something nudged me out of sleep. The air felt colder than before. I lay still and listened. For a few seconds, all I heard was my own breathing. Then I heard something faint outside the cabin. It wasn't a clear sound, more like a soft, steady movement. Something brushing lightly against the ground. Something walking. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Slow steps, not heavy, not too close, but steady enough to know it wasn't the wind. It didn't last long, maybe 20 or 30 seconds. Then it stopped completely. The silence after that felt worse than the sound. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Something common, something harmless, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I tried to put it out of my mind. I stepped outside to look around. The air was cold and wet, and thin mist hung between the trees. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the ground without really knowing what I expected to find. There were marks in the dirt, but the soil was too mixed with leaves and small rocks to show a clear print. I couldn't tell if they were from an animal or from something else. I told myself to relax. I wasn't used to being alone in a place this quiet. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. That day, I stayed around the cabin, trying to settle in. I read a little, walked around the area, and tried to enjoy the stillness. But every time I looked into the woods, I felt like the trees were hiding something. Like there was depth behind them I couldn't see into. A space nothing light could reach. By the second night, the uneasiness had grown. I didn't eat much. My stomach felt tight. I kept checking the windows even though I knew I locked them. When the sky finally turned dark, the woods started to look like a solid wall of black. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come fast. But a few hours later, I woke again. This time the air felt thicker, as if the temperature had dropped to freezing. My skin felt tight from the cold. The sound came again. Footsteps outside the cabin, moving with that same slow, steady pace as the night before. But this time, the steps were closer. I could hear the weight shift. I could hear leaves crunch in a slow pattern. I stayed completely still. My chest barely moved as I breathed. The steps circled halfway around the cabin, then stopped near the back door. The cabin walls were thin. I could hear the faint creak of wood outside, like someone shifting their weight. The back door was only a few feet from where I was lying in the small bedroom. For a moment, I felt the strange sensation that whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake. A long silence followed. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I waited for something else to happen. Maybe a door handle turning. Maybe a window shifting. But nothing came. After a while, the quiet stretched so far that I started doubting my own ears. I stayed awake until dawn. That morning I was done pretending everything was normal. I threw on my coat and went outside again. The ground behind the cabin looked disturbed. The leaves were pushed aside in a wider area than before. More marks, more signs that something had been there. I crouched down and studied them as best as I could. The soil was soft, and I could see depth in some of the marks. Too spaced apart to be a small animal. Too even to be random. I checked the back door. The frame had a small chip of wood missing near the lock. It hadn't been there the day before. That was when I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my bag without caring how it fit. The cabin felt darker while I packed, like the shadows lingered longer in the corners. When I stepped outside to leave, the air felt strangely still, as if the woods were waiting for something. The trail back to my car felt longer. The trees around me looked tighter together. Every sound made me jerk my head. At one point I thought I heard steps behind me, light ones, matching my pace. When I stopped, the forest went dead quiet. I couldn't see anything behind me, but I didn't waste time staring. I kept moving. When I reached my car, I felt the first bit of relief in days. I threw my bag inside, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. As I drove down the narrow road, the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The farther I got, the easier it was to breathe. The woods slowly thinned out, and the daylight finally felt real again. I made it home the same evening, and the moment I stepped inside my house, I locked every door and window. I stood there listening to the familiar sounds of my home. Cars outside, people talking in the distance, dogs barking. All the normal things I usually ignored. Now they felt comforting. I still don't know who or what was walking around that cabin at night. Could have been a person. Maybe someone living hidden in those woods. Maybe someone who watches cabins for people who stay alone. Maybe someone who waits for the right night to see if a lock will hold or break. I don't need the answer. I only know one thing for sure. I will never stay alone in a cabin deep in the woods again. Whatever moved around that place at night was real, and it was close. Close enough to touch the door. Close enough to wait in the dark while I slept only a few feet away. And walking away from that place in daylight felt like escaping something that wasn't finished with me yet. I started the trip because I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. Work had been dragging me down for months, and my mind felt heavy all the time. I chose a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, the kind of place where you could sit all day and just listen to wind move through trees. I didn't think much about safety or plans. I just packed food, warm clothes, a flashlight, and drove out early in the morning while the roads were still empty. The cabin looked old the moment I saw it. The wood was dark and cracked in places, the windows cloudy from age, and the porch had long scratches across it, as if something heavy had been dragged there. I remember thinking it was probably from furniture or tools someone pulled across years ago, but even then it made me feel uneasy. I pushed that feeling down, telling myself I was overthinking things, and carried my bags inside. The air inside smelled like dust and cold wood. The floor creaked under every step, and the place felt tighter than I expected, even though it wasn't actually small. I checked each corner, not because I was scared, but because I wanted to understand the space I would be living in for the next couple of days. The kitchen was cramped and old. The bedroom had a thin mattress and a single blanket that looked too worn to trust, so I used my own. The living room had a small wood stove, a chair, and a single window facing the forest. That window made me feel strange. I kept imagining someone standing outside, staring in. I shook it off and went back outside to get firewood. The woods around the cabin were dense. The trees looked older than the cabin itself, twisted in ways that made their branches look like frozen hands. The silence out there felt thick, as if the forest swallowed every sound. I could hear my breathing louder than anything else. It felt like the air didn't want to carry any noise. I collected fallen branches for firewood, but I kept glancing around, almost expecting to see someone standing far between the trees. There was never anyone there, yet the feeling stuck to me. When night came, it came fast. The woods grew darker than I thought possible, the kind of darkness where even the outlines of trees disappeared. I made a small fire inside the stove and tried to settle down. The cabin felt too quiet. I kept noticing small things that didn't sit right. A chair slightly angled toward the window when I was sure I left it straight. My bag shifted from where I placed it earlier. A cupboard door slightly open when I remembered closing it. I told myself I was remembering wrong, or maybe the floor was uneven and causing things to shift, but a tight feeling grew in my chest. The first real noise came late in the night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Then I heard something outside, something heavy stepping on dry leaves. It wasn't a small animal. It was slow and steady, like someone walking around the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. The steps circled the cabin, one careful step at a time, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard but couldn't hide their weight. I wanted to convince myself it was a deer or something like that, but I knew the difference. This was too controlled, too intentional. The steps stopped near the window in the living room. I could feel the exact spot in my mind. The window faced my bed through the open doorway. I stared into the darkness and imagined someone standing there, studying the glass, studying the cabin. I waited for a shadow or movement or any hint of what was there, but I saw nothing. The steps continued after a long pause, moving away into the woods until the silence returned. I barely slept for the rest of the night. In the morning, the ground around the cabin looked disturbed. The leaves near the window were crushed flat. There were long, deep footprints leading around the cabin, but the shapes were too smudged to tell what kind of shoes they were. Seeing them made my stomach sink. Someone had been there. Someone who walked close around the cabin while I was inside. I kept telling myself maybe it was a lost hiker, but the nearest trail was hours away. Nobody would wander out here by accident. I thought about leaving early, but I convinced myself I was imagining danger. I told myself I was tired, stressed, and letting fear make small things look bigger. I stayed even though something in my instincts pushed against that choice. The second night was worse. I kept a small lamp on and stayed in the chair near the stove. The fire crackled softly, and each sound outside made my skin tighten. Hours passed with nothing unusual, and I started thinking maybe the footsteps from the night before had been my own imagination blending with animal movement. Then, around midnight, I heard something on the porch. A single slow step, then another. The boards creaked under a heavy weight. It didn't sound like wandering. It sounded like cautious testing, like someone putting their full weight down only after checking the stability of each plank. I felt my heartbeat thudding in my throat. I leaned forward slightly, trying to control my breath. The steps stopped right at the front door. The doorknob made a soft ticking noise, as if someone touched it gently and tested whether it would turn. They didn't force it. They didn't jiggle it. They just pressed enough to feel if it moved. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open even though I had locked it. The knob stopped moving after a few seconds, but whoever was outside didn't walk away. They just stood there. I could feel it through the wood. I could almost sense the weight of their body on the other side. Minutes passed, long, slow minutes that felt like they stretched for hours, before the steps finally moved again. They went down the porch stairs, but instead of walking back into the woods, they stopped under the window again. That same window I had felt uneasy about from the first day. I stared at the glass, barely blinking. The firelight made faint reflections, but behind the reflections I thought I saw a darker shadow, something tall and still. I didn't move at all. The shadow didn't move either. After a long time, it slowly backed away, not turning, not breaking its shape, just fading as it stepped into deeper darkness until I couldn't see anything anymore. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, the footprints were clearer. Not animal, human, larger than mine, spaced out in long strides, circling the cabin again and again as if studying it from every angle. There were deep marks under the window where someone had stood for a long time. There were also scratches on the door, small but fresh, like a tool had been dragged lightly over the wood. That was the moment everything felt real. I stopped doubting myself. Someone had come both nights. Someone was watching the cabin, watching me. I packed everything fast. I didn't even eat. I stuffed my sleeping bag, shoved clothes into my backpack without folding them, and kept checking the tree line every few seconds. The forest felt alive, not with animals, but with eyes. I felt like I was being watched again, maybe from behind one of the thick trees, maybe from farther back where I couldn't see. I locked the cabin even though there was no point. I didn't want to turn my back, but I had to. I walked to my car as fast as I could without running, because running felt like it would trigger something. The forest around me stayed silent the whole time, as if holding its breath. When I finally got the car door open, I felt something shift in the woods behind me. I didn't look. I just got in, slammed the door, and started driving. I kept checking the mirror to see if someone stepped onto the road, but nothing ever did. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, and the tight feeling in my chest stayed until I reached the highway miles away. When I got home, I checked my bags. At the very bottom, under my clothes, I found something that wasn't mine. A small, folded piece of dirty cloth. Old, yellowed, and worn thin. I didn't know how it got there. I knew I didn't pack it. I never saw it in the cabin. Somehow, someone had put it inside my stuff. That was the final thing that made everything clear. Whoever had walked around the cabin those nights wasn't just a stranger passing through. They weren't curious. They were letting me know they had been inside that cabin before I ever came, and they got close enough to my things to put that cloth there. I never went back to any cabin after that. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel the same pressure on my chest, like I'm being watched again. And the part that stays with me the most isn't the footsteps or the shadow at the window. It's the thought that whoever stood outside the door those nights probably knew I was awake the whole time, listening, too afraid to breathe too loudly. And they didn't try to come in because they didn't want to. They wanted me to leave. They wanted me to know they were there. I went to the cabin because I wanted to be alone for a few days and clear my head. I had been feeling trapped in my daily routine, like every day was exactly the same. And the idea of sitting in a quiet wooden place surrounded by trees felt like a break I needed. I chose a cabin far from the main road, a place that didn't have neighbors nearby. I thought the silence would help me rest. I didn't realize that too much silence can feel heavy, like a weight pressing on your skin until it becomes hard to breathe. The cabin was small, made from old wood that had turned dark from years of weather. The porch had a single broken chair leaning on one side, as if someone had once tried to sit on it and gave up halfway. The air smelled like damp soil and pine, and the inside of the cabin smelled even stronger, a mix of dust, wood, and something I couldn't place at first. It wasn't exactly bad, but it wasn't exactly pleasant either. It felt like the smell of something that had been locked away for too long. Inside, the place had a single room with a small bed, a wooden table, 2 shelves, and a window facing the thick woods. I dropped my bag on the floor and checked every corner of the cabin even though I knew I was alone. I don't know why I always do that, but it makes me feel a bit safer to see everything before settling in. Everything looked normal, but the smell I had noticed before was stronger near the walls. It reminded me of wet clothing that had dried too slowly, but heavier, like the smell had soaked into the wood over the years. By evening, the air outside had turned colder. The cabin didn't have proper heating, just a small stove, so I lit a fire inside it. Watching the flames made me feel calmer. The woods outside were becoming darker, and the shapes of the trees slowly blended together until they formed one giant black wall. I ate a simple meal and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place felt off. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the opposite, too quiet. Even the wind barely moved the branches. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I decided to go to bed early since there wasn't much else to do. The mattress was thin and the blanket felt rough, but I didn't care. I lay flat and tried to fall asleep, but my mind wouldn't stop thinking about that strange smell. At some point during the night, I woke up without knowing why. I opened my eyes, and for a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. The room was completely dark except for a faint glow from the stove. The fire had almost died out, and the only sound was my own breathing. Then I noticed something else. It was faint, but I heard a soft dragging noise outside the cabin. It wasn't footsteps. It was slower, like something moving over the ground. I lay still, trying to listen, but the sound faded. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something heavier moving through the bushes. I pulled the blanket up to my chest and tried to fall asleep again, but I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling even though I couldn't see it clearly. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp. The ground looked normal, but near the cabin, the soil seemed disturbed. It was subtle, but I noticed that the dirt looked moved, like someone or something had dragged something around during the night. The marks weren't clear enough to identify. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe an animal digging or rubbing against the side of the cabin. I forced myself to ignore it and went for a walk to clear my thoughts. The woods looked peaceful during the day. Birds were moving between branches, and the sunlight broke through the trees in thin lines. But even then, I felt this strange tension in the air. It was like the forest held something it didn't want to show me. Every time I stopped walking, I felt like the quiet around me thickened, like I was standing in a place where sound didn't travel normally. When I got back to the cabin, the smell inside felt stronger again. I walked along the walls, touching the wood lightly with my fingertips, trying to figure out where the smell came from. The boards near the back corner felt slightly damp. When I pressed my hand against them, a cold sensation spread through my palm. It felt like the wall was holding moisture, but the rest of the cabin was dry. That night, the dragging sound returned. It started earlier, before I was fully asleep. This time it was slightly louder, and it came from behind the cabin. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling again, trying to stay calm. My heart was beating faster than it should have. The dragging noise moved slowly, pausing, then continuing. I could hear the weight of whatever it was pressing against the ground. I didn't want to look out the window. I didn't want to see anything standing there. After several minutes, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt worse. I stayed completely still, afraid that even breathing too loudly would attract something. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. When morning came again, I stepped outside slowly. The ground behind the cabin had deeper marks, long ones that curved toward the trees. Again, not clear footprints, just long, uneven trails through the soil. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest as I looked at them. It didn't feel like an animal. Something about the way the marks moved around the cabin felt deliberate. I made up my mind right there. I packed my things quickly. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. Whatever was moving around the cabin at night wasn't something I wanted to face. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me leave. I locked the cabin door even though I didn't know what good it would do, and I walked toward the trail that led back to my car. I didn't look back, not even once. When I reached the road and finally saw my car, I felt a weight lift from my chest. As I drove away, I kept imagining what might still be moving around that cabin at night, dragging itself through the dirt. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real. And I know leaving when I did was the best choice I've made in a long time. headed to the cabin because I needed a place where no one could bother me. It sat deep in the woods, far from the road, far from any neighbors, and far from anything that could make me think about work or family stress. I told myself I only needed 2 nights alone. Just silence, fresh air, and a break from everything. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. I didn't plan for fear or tension, or the feeling that someone else might be watching me from the tree line. The path to the cabin was rough, covered with fallen branches, soft mud, and patches where the ground dipped suddenly as if something large had been dragged through earlier. It felt normal at first, just part of the woods. I kept walking, carrying my heavy backpack, sweating from the weight of it as the cold air pressed against my face. The sky was turning gray even though it was still early, and a sharp wind moved through the trees. I could hear the branches rubbing against each other, making a dry, scratching sound that followed me as I walked. The cabin finally came into view after nearly an hour of hiking. It was small, old, and made of dark wood that looked soft from years of rain. The front steps sagged a little, and one of the windows had a crack running across the glass. It wasn't pretty, but it was quiet. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air felt cold and stale, like it hadn't been breathed in for months. Dust covered the table, the shelves, even the small counter in the corner where a rusty gas stove sat. I set my bag down and looked around, trying to get used to the silence. There wasn't much inside. Just a bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden chair, a single lamp, and a heavy door that led to a tiny storage room. Everything seemed normal, but I didn't like how dark the corners felt, especially in the storage room doorway. Even during the day, the shadows there looked deeper than they should have. I spent the first few hours cleaning a bit, wiping the dust off the table, sweeping the floor with an old broom I found leaning in the corner. I tried to get comfortable. I made a small meal, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window. The woods looked calm. Tall trees, thick bushes, and nothing moving except the wind pressing against the leaves. But as the daylight started to fade, the woods seemed to change. The trees looked closer now, as if the darkness pulled them in. I noticed something else too. The path I had walked earlier looked disturbed, like fresh marks had appeared on it. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the longer I stared, the more clear it looked. There were long, uneven drag lines leading toward the trees. Not straight, not clean, just messy marks like someone had pulled something heavy across the ground. I tried to ignore it. I closed the curtain. I decided to focus on the inside, but the cabin itself didn't help. Once night settled in, everything started making noise. The wood creaked, the walls clicked, and sometimes the wind pushed so hard against the door that it made a dull thumping sound. I kept looking toward the storage room without meaning to. Every time I looked, the dark doorway made me feel like something might be waiting inside, just far enough back that I couldn't see it. When I finally went to bed, I kept the lamp on. I didn't usually sleep with lights on anywhere, but the cabin didn't feel right. The mattress was thin and cold, and every time I shifted, the bed frame gave a loud groan that echoed through the room. I tried closing my eyes, but I couldn't relax. I kept listening for footsteps outside, for breathing, for anything that would explain the feeling growing in my chest. Sometime deep in the night, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. It was quick, a heavy thud, like something solid had fallen straight against the wooden wall. I sat up fast. My heart started racing. I waited, holding my breath, listening for another sound. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard a second sound, softer, sliding across the outside wall, slow and steady, like someone dragging their hand or something else across the wood. I stayed still in the bed, trying to understand what I was hearing. The cabin didn't have animals climbing on it as far as I knew. There were no large predators around this area. The dragging sound moved along the wall all the way to the window. I didn't dare look. I just stayed there with my eyes squeezed shut until the noise finally stopped. When morning came, I stepped outside slowly, looking at the wall where the sound came from. The wood was scratched, fresh marks, long, thin lines, uneven and rough. I ran my hand over them and felt splinters sticking out. Something had definitely moved along that wall, and whatever made the marks had strength, enough to tear the surface of the cabin. I should have left then, packed my things, walked back to my car, and gone home. But I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer had rubbed against the wall, or maybe the wind had slammed a branch into it. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal, so I stayed. The second night felt worse. The woods felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and I kept feeling like something was moving between the trees even though I couldn't see anything. A few times I heard short, sharp snapping sounds, like twigs breaking under a heavy step. They came from different directions, as if something kept circling the cabin. Inside, I stayed close to the lamp. The shadows felt like they reached farther across the room now, especially from the storage room. I kept thinking I should close the door to it, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to walk over there. It felt wrong to get too close. The sun went down slower than usual that day, as if it was fighting to stay in the sky. When it finally disappeared, the woods outside fell completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just flat, empty quiet. Then the noise started again. First, the same dragging sound outside the wall. Slow, steady, moving from one side of the cabin to the next. Then something tapped against the window. Not hard, just a light tap like someone testing the glass with their finger. The tapping kept going, soft and spaced out, and every time it hit the window I felt my chest tighten a little more. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loudly. I sat on the bed with my back pressed against the wall, watching the curtain, waiting for it to move, praying it wouldn't. At some point, the tapping stopped. The dragging stopped, but I didn't feel safe. I kept listening to the silence, and then I heard something inside the cabin. A soft step, very slow, coming from the storage room. My whole body froze. I didn't move even an inch. I stared at the open doorway across the room. The darkness inside looked deeper than before, almost like it wasn't just a shadow but something heavier resting in the air. I waited. I didn't hear another step. The silence stretched on, but the feeling didn't leave. Something was in there with me. I could feel it. Not moving, not breathing loudly, but there. I didn't turn off the lamp that night. I stayed awake until I saw the sun come through the cracks in the curtains. As soon as there was enough light to see, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside without care, and ran out of the cabin. I didn't even look back at the storage room doorway. When I stepped onto the path, I saw more drag marks on the ground. Fresh ones, deep ones. They led from the back of the cabin into the thick trees. I didn't follow them. I didn't try to figure out what made them. I just walked as fast as I could, almost running, until I reached my car. I never went back to that cabin. I never tried to clean it out or check inside again. Whatever was in there, whatever had moved around the cabin, whatever had stood inside the storage room during the second night, it stayed there. That was all I needed to know. The ending to it all was simple and clear. I escaped because I left before it could happen a third night. I didn't wait for answers, and I didn't try to be brave. I listened to the fear, and I survived because of it. Now, whenever I think about cabins or woods or dark rooms, I remember that place and the sound of those slow footsteps. And I know without any doubt that something real was there with me. Something dangerous. Something that didn't need to be supernatural to terrify me. It was real enough. I went to the cabin because I needed to clear my head after weeks of feeling stuck in my own life. I picked a random old rental far from the road, deep inside thick woods where the air felt cold even before winter. The place looked small from the outside, almost lost between tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. The wooden walls were dark from years of weather, and the roof sagged a little on one side. It looked lonely, but that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't think anything bad could happen out there. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that makes you believe nothing exists outside the line of trees. Inside, the cabin smelled like old dust and dry wood. The floor creaked every time I moved. There was only one room with a small bed, a heavy table, and a narrow window facing the forest. I dropped my backpack near the wall and walked around, trying to get used to the stillness. The air felt colder inside than outside, but I thought it was just because the place hadn't been used for a while. I opened all the windows to let some air in, then I went back out to gather firewood before it got dark. The forest had a strange quiet to it. No birds, no insects, nothing. My own footsteps were the loudest thing around me. Every time I bent down to pick up a dry branch, I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I wasn't sure why. I tried to brush off the weird feeling and blamed it on being alone in a new place. I returned to the cabin with an armful of wood, and by then the sun was already low behind the trees. The shadows looked stretched and sharp. When darkness fell, it came fast. I could barely see anything through the window. I lit the fire in the small stone fireplace and watched the flames fill the cabin with a soft orange glow. I felt a little better after that. I made some food, ate slowly, listened to the wood burn. The crackling sounds helped me relax. I thought I might actually sleep early for once. But then I heard something outside. It started faint, a soft crunch in the snow-covered ground or dried leaves. I couldn't tell. I thought maybe it was a deer or some animal roaming near the cabin. The woods were full of them. I ignored it at first, but the sound came again, this time closer. Then again. Slow, steady steps moving in a strange pattern. Not wandering like an animal, but stopping for long moments, then starting again. I sat still, trying to hear better. The cabin felt even colder. The firelight flickered against the walls, making the shadows move like they were breathing. I didn't want to panic over nothing, so I forced myself to stay calm. I kept listening. The steps stopped completely for a long time, long enough that I started to think I had imagined them. I stood up and went to check the door, making sure it was locked. The metal latch felt old but strong enough. I checked the window next. When I leaned close to the glass, all I could see was my own faint reflection, and behind it, nothing but deep black between the trees. I stayed there for a few seconds, but something about the silence felt heavy, like something out there was waiting for me to look away first. I returned to the bed and sat on the edge, keeping the fire in my sight. The warmth helped, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I tried to lie down, but every time I closed my eyes, the quiet pressed on my ears in a way that made my chest tight. I sat up again. Then the steps started once more. This time they were right outside the cabin. Slow, careful. There was no mistaking them now. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stayed completely still, listening to each step land softly in the dirt. I stared at the door, watching the small gap under it, waiting to see if something would move across it. The fire crackled again, but I barely noticed. My heartbeat felt louder than anything else in the room. The steps circled around the cabin. I could hear them move around the walls one side at a time. Whoever or whatever was out there was walking slowly, like they were checking the place, studying it, studying me. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe too loud. The cabin was thin and weak, and I realized how stupid I had been to come out here alone without telling anyone exactly where I was. The nearest road was miles away. There was no service on my phone. Even if I screamed, no one would hear me. The steps stopped again right outside the window. I stared at the glass, my whole body tight. Nothing showed, but I could feel something on the other side. A weight, a presence. Like someone was standing there, not moving, just watching. The fire popped loudly, and the sudden noise made my heart jump so hard I almost fell off the bed. After several minutes, the steps moved again, slower this time, until they faded away behind the cabin. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, facing the door, waiting for something to happen. Every sound the forest made felt like it was creeping closer, but no more steps came. When the first weak light of morning finally touched the window, I felt my whole body loosen as if I had been clenching every muscle all night. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The cold morning air felt sharp. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. First, everything looked normal. Then I saw them. Footprints. One single line of footprints circling the cabin. Human footprints. Bare feet, long and thin, pressing deep into the frozen soil. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't boots. They were bare feet in the freezing cold, walking slowly around every wall of the cabin again and again. The sight of them made my stomach twist. I followed them a little distance into the trees, but they stopped suddenly after a few meters, as if the person vanished into thin air. No trail leading away, just a dead end. I felt watched again in that moment, even though the morning light was bright. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside without care, and locked the cabin out of instinct even though it meant nothing. I walked fast through the woods, never turning back, the trees around me feeling tighter than the night before. Every crack of a twig made me flinch. It felt like someone could step out from behind any tree at any second. When I finally reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept walking until I reached my car. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. I didn't start breathing normally until I was halfway back to town. I never reported it. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. No crime had happened. No one touched me, but something or someone walked barefoot around that cabin, in freezing temperatures, watching me in the dark for hours. And the worst part is how slow the steps had been. Slow like they weren't afraid of anything. Slow like they had all the time in the world. I will never go back to that cabin, and I will never sleep in the woods alone again. Because whatever was out there that night wasn't an animal, wasn't a ghost, and wasn't a trick of my imagination. It was real, it was human, and it wanted something from me. I still don't know what. And the more I think about those footprints ending in the middle of the forest, the more I feel like I escaped something I wasn't meant to see twice. I never planned to spend a night alone in that cabin. It happened because I made a stupid choice that seemed harmless at the time. I had planned a weekend in the woods to clear my head, get away from noise, and just breathe for a while. The cabin belonged to a coworker who said I could use it whenever I wanted. It was a small wooden place sitting deep inside a forest that looked untouched for years. I liked the idea of being alone with nature, far away from busy roads and loud people. At least that is what I thought I wanted. I arrived in the afternoon, parked my car under a few tall pines, and walked up to the cabin. The ground was soft with layers of dry needles and damp soil. The air felt clean in a way city air never feels. The cabin itself looked old but stable. The steps creaked when I walked up them, and the door felt slightly swollen from rain. Inside, everything smelled like old wood and dust. A single table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and a shelf with random old tools. The place felt empty in a peaceful way at first, like it had been waiting untouched for months. I opened the windows to let in fresh air and walked around outside for a moment. Birds were making distant sounds, and I could hear the forest moving slowly with the wind. Nothing felt wrong then. I actually felt lucky, like this was going to be a calm weekend. I settled in, put my bag on the bed, and heated up some simple food on a small gas stove. But around evening, a strange tension began settling into the forest. It wasn't sudden, just something I noticed between moments. The air turned colder faster than I expected. The sunlight disappeared behind the trees earlier than it should have, and the silence became too strong, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Even the birds had stopped. I tried not to think too much about it and stayed inside. I shut the windows, locked the door even though I wasn't worried about people, and turned on a small lantern I brought. The cabin filled with soft yellow light, but the corners stayed dark like the walls were drinking up the light. I sat on the bed for a while, trying to relax, but there was something about the quiet that felt wrong. It was the kind of quiet that made your own breathing sound too loud. At some point during the night, I heard a noise on the porch. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone stepping slowly on old wood. Just one step, then another. Slow, careful, almost testing the boards. I froze. I held my breath without even realizing it. I felt this cold wave spreading inside my chest as the steps stopped right outside the door. I waited for something else, maybe another step or the door handle turning, but nothing happened. The silence returned, thicker than before. I sat like that for minutes, maybe longer. My ears felt hot as I listened. I didn't move until I felt a light trembling in my muscles from staying still for too long. I kept telling myself it could be an animal. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. Something harmless. But animals move. They wander. They don't take 2 slow steps and then wait silently like a person deciding what to do next. I couldn't sleep after that, so I stayed on the bed, leaning against the wall, trying to stay awake. Every little sound made me tense up. The cabin made small popping noises as the temperature dropped. The trees outside scraped slightly against each other. Nothing else moved. Around midnight, something touched the outside wall. It sounded like a hand brushing lightly along the boards. Slow, dragging. A soft, steady stroke that moved from one side of the wall toward the back of the cabin. The way it moved made my skin crawl. I sat completely still, staring at the lantern, watching its weak light flicker. The sound stopped somewhere near the back window. I didn't dare look. For the next hour, nothing happened. Or maybe things did happen and I just didn't hear them because my heartbeat felt so loud. I kept imagining someone standing just behind the window, looking in, waiting for a moment when I wasn't alert. I kept picturing shapes in the shadows even though I tried not to let my mind go there. My mouth felt dry, and my hands were getting cold even though the lantern was a little warm. I must have stayed like that for a long time because my back started hurting. I slowly shifted my weight, trying not to make any noise. When I moved, the bed made a small sound. Not loud at all, just a little movement. But right after it, I heard something crunch outside near the corner of the cabin. A light step on the forest floor. The timing was too perfect. Almost like something had been waiting to hear if I was still awake or moving. My chest felt tight, and my hands started shaking. I leaned forward and turned the lantern down until it was almost off. I didn't want the light anymore. It made me feel exposed. I let the cabin fall into a deeper darkness and sat there listening again. The footsteps outside were faint but real, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. They didn't rush. They didn't back away. They just moved with a steady, cautious rhythm. At that moment, I realized I couldn't stay the whole night. The cabin felt like a trap. A small wooden box with thin walls that offered no safety at all. I knew I needed to leave at the first sign of morning, even if I didn't sleep at all. I stayed alert until the faintest light started to appear through the trees. It wasn't real daylight yet, but the forest began to show shapes again instead of just darkness. The footsteps had stopped hours earlier, or maybe I just couldn't hear them once exhaustion started dulling my senses. As soon as I could see the outlines of the room clearly, I grabbed my bag quietly and prepared to leave. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The air felt cold and sharp. I looked around without moving too fast. The ground had clear marks in the dirt, shoe prints. Not boots for hiking, not thick prints. They looked like worn-out sneakers, uneven and pressed deep in some places like whoever it was stood still for long periods. They circled the cabin. They stopped under windows. They crossed the porch more than once. They even led toward the trees before fading into the darker soil. I followed them with my eyes and felt a sickness in my stomach. Someone had been out there watching the cabin for hours. Someone who didn't try to knock, didn't try to talk, didn't try to enter. Someone who wanted something else. Maybe just to scare me. Maybe something worse. The forest felt different now. It looked open in the daylight, but knowing what had walked around me all night made every tree feel dangerous. I walked straight to my car without stopping. I kept expecting to see someone standing behind a trunk or crouching in the distance, but I didn't. I got in the car, locked the doors immediately, and drove away as fast as the rough path allowed. I didn't look back until I was near the main road. When I did, the forest stood strangely still and quiet, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had been a dream. But the marks around the cabin were real. The steps on the porch were real. The slow brushing hand against the wall was real. I knew it. I felt it. I never went back to that cabin. I told my coworker I wasn't comfortable using it anymore, and that was all. I didn't explain the details. They wouldn't have believed the parts one kept to myself anyway. And even now, long after that night, sometimes I still feel the same cold tightness in my chest when I walk outside alone in the dark. It reminds me of how silence can hide someone just a few steps away. It reminds me how thin a wall really is. And it reminds me that someone out there had stood in the dark for hours, staring at a small wooden cabin, waiting for something I never wanted to learn. I left that place, but the feeling of being watched in total silence has never fully left me. Sometimes I think about those footprints circling the cabin and how fresh they were. They weren't old. They weren't fading. They were from just hours before I saw them. I got out just in time. If I had stayed another night, I don't think the person outside would have stayed patient. I think they were testing the first night, learning my movements, seeing how I reacted. And that thought alone is enough to keep me away from any quiet cabin deep in the woods for the rest of my life. I learned exactly how real fear can feel when the danger isn't a story or a creature or some made-up thing. It's just another person, standing in the dark, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. I drove up the narrow forest road late in the afternoon, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had been sitting in my chest ever since I left the main highway. The road felt too quiet, too empty, with tall pines closing in from both sides, making the sky look thin and far away. The cabin I had rented was supposed to be simple and peaceful, a place where I could spend a few days alone, clear my head, and get away from noise and people. I liked quiet places and I liked being by myself, but something about the silence felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on the top of my head. When I finally reached the cabin, the sky was already dim. The place looked older than the photos, with faded wood and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. There was a small shed next to it, leaning sideways as if tired of standing. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. I stepped out of my car, and the first thing I noticed was how far the sound traveled. Even my footsteps sounded too loud. It was like the forest swallowed normal sounds and only let certain ones escape. Inside the cabin, everything was dusty and still. The floor creaked under my weight, and the smell of old wood mixed with the faint scent of something metallic that I couldn't place. The windows were small and fogged from the inside, and even after wiping them with my sleeve, the view outside looked blurred, like the trees were leaning close and breathing against the glass. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, trying to make myself feel at home. But the whole time, I kept glancing toward the windows. I couldn't shake the idea that someone might be standing deep between the trees, watching the cabin, watching me. It made no sense, but the feeling kept returning in small waves. That first night, I lay on the bed, listening to the forest. At first, it was just normal night sounds. The wind moving through branches, tiny cracks from the wood cooling down, maybe a small animal passing through the bushes. But then something heavier moved outside, slow steps on the dry leaves, not rushing, not sneaking, just walking. I forced myself to stay still. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a stray dog. But the steps kept circling the cabin in a long, steady pattern, almost like someone slowly checking each wall, each window, each corner. I stared at the ceiling until the sound faded, but sleep didn't come for a long time. The next morning, everything looked normal again. I tried to convince myself I was just tired from the long drive and imagining things. I made myself walk around outside to prove it, but when I reached the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my skin tighten. The dirt behind the cabin was disturbed in several places, dragged and flattened, like someone had walked there over and over during the night. The prints weren't clear enough to tell if they were human or animal, but they were too large and too deep to be from something small. I felt stupid for worrying. I told myself it was probably just some forest animal. Still, I couldn't stop checking the tree line again and again. The forest felt different in daylight, still quiet, but now it felt like it was waiting. The second night was worse. The noises started earlier, before I even got into bed. Slow crunching footsteps again, stopping and starting, getting close, then fading, then returning even slower. I sat in the dark, listening, trying to breathe quietly, trying not to make the bed creak. My heart felt too loud in my chest. The footsteps paused near the bedroom window, and I lay there frozen, barely breathing. I imagined someone or something standing just outside the glass, staring in, studying the shape of my body under the blanket. Hours passed like glue drying. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, the back of the cabin showed even more disturbed dirt, more dragged marks, like someone had been pacing behind the building for hours. I checked my car, but nothing seemed touched. The forest felt heavier than before, like the air itself was watching me. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt hunted. By the third day, I was exhausted. My hands shook when I tried to cook something, and I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few seconds. I kept turning my head toward the windows, feeling a strange pressure behind my eyes, the kind you get when someone is staring at you for too long. I thought about leaving early, but I didn't want to drive down that narrow forest road while tired. I told myself one more night would be fine. That was a mistake. That last night is still burned into my mind. The cabin felt tighter, smaller, like the walls were closing in. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the air still and heavy. I sat on the bed with the small lamp on, not wanting to lie down yet. Then I heard it again, the slow steps in the leaves, but this time they were closer from the start, heavier than before, as if whoever had been walking around the cabin finally got tired of keeping distance. The footsteps circled the cabin again, but not in the calm, steady way before. They moved in short bursts, stopping suddenly, then rushing a few steps, then stopping again. The pattern sounded nervous, or excited, or impatient. I felt sweat forming on my back even though the air was cold. When the steps reached the bedroom window again, they didn't just stay for a moment like the previous night. They stayed long enough that I could hear faint breathing through the thin glass. Slow and controlled, like someone trying not to be noticed even while standing right there. My skin crawled. I moved the lamp slightly, and its shadow shifted across the wall. The breathing paused for half a second, like whoever was out there reacted to the movement of light inside. That small reaction terrified me even more because it proved there was someone out there, not just an animal. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My muscles ached from staying in one position. Eventually the footsteps moved again, slowly at first, then circling faster, like someone getting more and more agitated. I realized I couldn't stay another minute in that place. I grabbed my keys, pushed the lamp off, and waited for a moment when the steps sounded farther from the front door. As soon as the moment came, I ran out of the cabin and sprinted toward my car. My breath came out in shaky bursts. The cold night air burned my lungs. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to know how close anything was. I unlocked the car with trembling hands, threw myself inside, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As the headlights came on, I caught a quick glimpse of movement near the edge of the trees. Something tall, something upright, something that stepped back into the darkness as soon as the light touched it. I couldn't see a face or details, but I saw enough to know it wasn't an animal on four legs. I drove down that forest road faster than I should have, gripping the wheel so tight my fingers hurt. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where bright lights made the world feel real again. I never went back for anything I left behind in that cabin. I didn't ask the owner any questions either. I didn't want explanations. Whatever had been walking around that cabin at night was real, and it wasn't something I wanted to understand. The ending is simple and clear. I survived by leaving. I trusted my fear in time, and I learned that sometimes the worst things in the world are not supernatural. They are real people, hidden in quiet places, waiting for someone foolish enough to be alone. I never stayed in a remote cabin again, and I never will. I never planned to stay in that cabin for more than one night. It was supposed to be a quick break from everything, a short escape after weeks of non-stop stress. I found the place through an old listing that looked almost abandoned, sitting deep inside a quiet forest a few hours from town. The photos showed a small wooden building with a metal roof, a narrow porch, and a view of thick trees stretching in every direction. It looked peaceful and empty, and that was all I wanted. I packed light, just some food, water, extra clothes, and basic tools. I wanted silence more than anything. The road to the cabin was a narrow dirt path that felt like it didn't want to be used anymore. The deeper I went, the rougher it became, until my tires slipped on loose stones and small branches slapped the sides of my car. There were no signs, no other turnoffs, no abandoned houses or farms on the way. Just trees, tall and close together, leaning over the road like they were trying to hide the sky. When I finally reached the cabin, my first thought was that it looked even more isolated than the pictures made it seem. The wood on the walls was old and cracked, the windows were cloudy, and the porch creaked under my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and something old, something that had been left alone for far too long. The floorboards had a soft groan every time I took a step. There was a small table near the window, a single bed pushed into the corner, and a narrow shelf with a few forgotten items. An empty tin cup, a broken lantern, and what looked like a rusted fishing hook. There was no electricity, only a small wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But I didn't mind. I came here for silence, and for a moment, I actually felt like I had found it. By the time evening came, the forest outside had grown darker in a way that felt heavier than normal. The trees didn't just block the sunlight, they swallowed it. I sat near the window, trying to enjoy the calm, but I kept noticing the stillness outside. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. It was the kind of silence that made my ears ring. When the sun finally disappeared and the forest went completely black, I lit a small battery lantern beside my bed. The soft light barely reached across the room, and the shadows looked like they were moving every time I blinked. I tried to sleep early, but the air inside the cabin felt strange. It wasn't cold, but it felt like someone had been there before me, someone who had just left, leaving their warmth behind. I brushed off the thought and lay down, staring at the roof. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that being alone in a place like this naturally messed with my head. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, steady crunch outside the cabin, like footsteps on dry leaves. But the forest floor near the cabin was mostly dirt and mud. There shouldn't have been enough leaves to make that sound. I stayed still, holding my breath as the crunching grew clearer. It moved carefully, slowly circling the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate, too heavy. They sounded like someone trying to walk quietly but failing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I lay in that bed, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It kept moving, circling again, pausing now and then as if whoever, or whatever, was listening for something inside. After a long time, the steps faded away. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night. I waited until the first light of morning finally pushed its way between the trees, and only then did I sit up. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The soft dirt around the cabin was full of footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were clearly human, pressed deep into the ground, circling the entire building in uneven loops. Some prints were close to the porch steps, close enough to look inside through the cracks around the frame. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost or passing through. They were watching. I decided right then that I was leaving before nightfall. But I needed to rest first because I hadn't slept at all. I told myself I would pack up after a short break. I stepped inside and closed the door. That was when I noticed something I had somehow missed before. On the floor near the door was a thin line of dirt, stretching in a straight path across the cabin toward the bed. I knew I hadn't tracked that in. It looked fresh, like someone had walked inside that morning. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling my heartbeat fill my whole body. I walked around the room, checking every corner, every gap, every dark spot, but there wasn't anyone inside. Still, the dirt trail was real, and it led straight to the side of the bed where I had been sleeping. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside it without caring how messy it was, and stepped onto the porch. I didn't even look back at the cabin. The forest felt bigger now, the trees closer, the silence heavier. I unlocked my car and got in as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally started, I took one quick breath of relief until I saw something in the side mirror. Not a face, not a shadow, just a handprint, a single, clear handprint on the rear window, smeared across the glass in a long drag, like someone had pressed their hand there and slowly slid it down. The print wasn't there when I arrived. I knew that for sure. Somehow, at some point in the night or early morning, someone had been close enough to touch my car, close enough to leave that mark. I didn't get out to clean it. I didn't stop to think. I drove down that rough dirt path faster than I should have, letting branches scrape the sides of the car, letting rocks slam under the tires. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept checking the mirrors again and again, expecting to see someone following. When I finally made it back to town, I parked under a bright streetlight and walked around the car. The handprint was still there, long and smeared, shaped like it belonged to someone with thin fingers and a deep grip. I wiped it off with my sleeve, but even after it was gone, I kept seeing it in my mind. I never went back for the things I left in that cabin. I never reported anything to anyone because I didn't have proof of anything except my own fear. But what bothers me the most, what keeps me awake some nights even now, is the dirt trail inside the cabin. The footprints around the walls were scary, but that thin line of dirt inside was worse. It meant someone had come in while I slept. Someone had stood beside the bed in the dark. Someone had watched me and walked back out without making a sound. And the single thing I keep thinking about is this: if they got inside without me hearing them, then what exactly stopped them from doing more? Whatever it was, I'm glad I woke up when I did. I never planned to stay in that cabin alone, but plans fall apart fast when you depend on other people. My cousin was supposed to join me for the long weekend, but at the last minute he backed out, saying he wasn't feeling well. I already had the place booked, already packed my gear, already prepared myself for a quiet few days away from everything. I told myself it wouldn't matter if I went alone. I liked the idea of silence anyway. I didn't think silence could feel dangerous. The cabin sat deep in a stretch of woods that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The dirt road leading there was narrow, and branches scraped the sides of my car the entire way in. I remember thinking the place looked almost abandoned when I first pulled up. It was small, plain, with old wood that had gone gray from years of weather. The windows looked cloudy, like they hadn't been washed in ages. Moss clung to the lower boards. The front steps felt soft under my boots, as if they had been absorbing moisture for too long. But the cabin stood solid enough, and the lock worked, so I carried my things inside. The air inside was cold and heavy, like it hadn't moved in days. Dust covered almost everything, especially the corners of the room where spiderwebs stretched tight like nets. There was a small table, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a shelf stacked with old camping supplies. The place smelled faintly of old wood, damp earth, and something metallic that I couldn't place at first. I opened windows to let in some air, but all that entered was the smell of pine trees and the sound of distant branches knocking against each other. First, nothing felt wrong. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the small space feel normal. I heated water on the small stove and walked outside with the mug in my hand, trying to shake off the strange heaviness of the place. The forest around the cabin felt endless. Tall trees stood so close together that their tops almost braided into each other. The shadows between them were thick even during the day. It felt like another world, separate from the one I came from. The first strange thing happened that evening, just as the sun started sinking. I had walked around behind the cabin to put away some firewood when I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. Not the shape of boots. Bare feet. They looked like they had been made recently, pressed deep into the soft soil, leading around the back wall and disappearing into the trees. They were spaced strangely, as if the person who made them had been walking slowly, almost dragging their feet. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them, trying to tell myself they were old, maybe from last summer when hikers passed through. But the edges were sharp, and the ground there had been softened by recent rain. Footprints that fresh shouldn't have been ignored, but I forced myself to anyway. I told myself someone had wandered by earlier in the day. I told myself it was nothing, Inside the cabin, the metallic smell seemed stronger than before. I checked the sink, the pipes, even the old rusty tools on the shelf, trying to find the source. I found nothing. I opened more windows, but the air still felt stale, like it refused to move. When night finally fell, the woods turned pitch black. Not the kind of darkness you get in the city or near roads. This was complete, thick darkness, where the trees became nothing more than shapes hidden behind more shapes. I lay in the bed, listening to the forest shift and creak and breathe around me. Sometime deep in the night, maybe close to midnight, I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened on their own like something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still, listening. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then I heard it, a soft, slow shuffling sound outside the wall near my bed. Footsteps, bare feet moving across the dirt. They were too close to ignore, too steady to be an animal. They stopped right beside the cabin, and the wood creaked. Not from the wind, but from weight leaning against it. I stayed frozen, breathing shallow, afraid to make a sound. I couldn't see anything through the dark window. I could only listen. The footsteps moved again, dragging lightly across the dirt as if circling the cabin. Then they faded into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked outside to check. The footprints were back. More of them this time. They circled the cabin, some overlapping, some freshly pressed. They were all bare, all strange. I felt my stomach tighten when I saw how close they came to the windows, as if someone had been standing there watching me while I slept. I scanned the tree line for movement, but nothing shifted except the wind pushing through branches. I wanted to leave, but I convinced myself to stay one more night. I felt stupid for thinking about running away because of footprints, but something about them made me uneasy. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, hiking small trails near the cabin, collecting wood, checking my car twice just to make sure nothing had been touched. By late afternoon, the air felt heavier than before. A storm was building far off, the sky turning a dull gray that made the forest even darker. As the wind picked up, I heard strange cracks echoing between the trees, like heavy branches snapping. I went inside early and locked the door, even though the lock felt weak and old. When night came, the storm didn't break. Instead, the air grew still and thick, and the woods became deathly quiet. No insects, no birds, not even wind. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I lay awake in the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to listen past my own heartbeat. Then it happened again. A slow, dragging step in the dirt. Then another, and another. This time the steps came from the deeper side of the woods, approaching the cabin with steady weight. I felt my skin go cold. The steps stopped right outside the window near my bed. The wood wall groaned under pressure, like someone was pressing a hand or a shoulder against it. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. Not loud, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't my imagination. Then the breathing stopped. Silence returned so suddenly it felt unnatural. I fought the urge to look out the window. Some instinct kept me still. Some part of me knew looking would make things worse. I stayed rigid until the first hint of dawn. When light finally crept into the woods, I forced myself outside. The footprints were everywhere, not just around the cabin, far more than before. They came from deeper in the woods, dozens of them, all leading toward the cabin like trails converging onto a single point. They weren't the footprints of a single person. There were too many sizes, too many directions. They all stopped within feet of the cabin. None of them walked away. That was the moment something clicked inside me. I didn't care what the explanation was. I didn't care who or what had been out there. I only cared about leaving. I packed everything in minutes, barely checking if I forgot anything. The forest felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to hesitate. As I reached my car, one detail froze me in place. Fresh footprints, bare, deep, stood in the mud beside the driver's door, as if someone had stood there during the night, watching my car, studying it, maybe waiting. I didn't look into the woods. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove away as fast as the road allowed, branches scraping my windows like hands trying to slow me down. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away. The moment my tires hit pavement, something in my chest loosened, like I had been holding my breath for 2 days straight. I never went back for the deposit. I never told the rental owner what happened. I don't care who they rent that place to next. What I saw, or more accurately, what I heard and what I found, was enough for me to know I was not alone in those woods. And whatever was there, it wasn't a single lost person wandering barefoot. Someone had been watching the cabin for a long time. Maybe several people. Maybe something more human than I ever wanted to meet. But the clearest part of the entire experience was this: the footprints never led away. I drove up to the old cabin because I needed a break from everything. My head felt heavy for weeks, and I wanted a place where I could sit alone with nothing but the cold air and the quiet trees. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who said I could use it anytime. I had been there once years ago, but only for a few hours. This time I packed enough food, water, and gear to stay 3 nights. I thought I knew what solitude felt like, but the kind I met out there had a weight to it that I wasn't ready for. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far away from the main road. The last stretch was a narrow dirt path covered with old leaves and broken branches. The air smelled wet and sharp, the kind of smell you get right before winter hits for real. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood exactly how I remembered it. Small, dark wood, metal roof, 1 window in the front, and a tiny shed to the left. Nothing looked dangerous or strange, just a quiet place in the middle of nowhere. Inside, the air was colder than outside. My breath floated in front of me in pale clouds. Dust covered the shelves, and the wood floor creaked under every step. I unpacked everything and set up my sleeping bag on the old bed frame. The springs groaned when I put my weight on it, but it held. I lit the small propane heater I brought, and the warmth slowly spread through the room. For a while, everything felt peaceful. I walked around the clearing, took pictures, checked the shed, and looked at the tree line. The forest felt thick and heavy, like the trees leaned in a little too close. The daylight faded fast, and the cold deepened, so I went back inside and settled in for the night. I ate, wrote a bit in my notebook, and then lay down. I wasn't tired, but there was nothing else to do. The first strange thing happened when I was lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind slow down. I felt a faint vibration through the wood floorboards. It reminded me of someone walking somewhere in the cabin, but it was too light for footsteps. Came and went like a soft tremor. I told myself it was just the heater causing the wood to expand. The cabin was old, after all. I tried to ignore it, but later in the night, I woke up to a different sound. A dull, steady scraping came from the back wall, low to the ground. I froze, staring at the dark ceiling again. The heater flickered quietly on the table. The scraping didn't speed up or slow down. It stayed steady, like someone dragging something small across the wall, then stopping, then starting again. I lay still for several minutes, listening. The sound stopped on its own. I tried to stay calm, thinking it might be a raccoon or some other animal brushing against the outside wall. I forced myself back to sleep, though it took a long time. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the wall. The ground was cold and hard. No tracks, no marks, no scraped dirt, nothing. I walked around the entire cabin and didn't see a single sign of an animal. The woods were silent in a strange way, like even the small birds didn't want to be there. As the day went on, I felt a pressure building in my chest. Every time I looked at the tree line, I felt like something was hidden behind it. There was nothing visible, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I walked farther out into the woods to calm myself, but the deeper I went, the more wrong the place felt. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that didn't crunch the way leaves normally do. They were damp and heavy. My boots sank a little with each step. I found something weird about 100 meters out. A fallen tree with deep marks in the bark. Not claw marks, not tool marks. They looked like something had been peeled away. Long strips of wood pulled upward. The exposed inner wood looked fresh, like it had been torn off recently. I touched it and felt how smooth it was, That bothered me more than anything because it meant it hadn't happened long before I arrived. When I went back to the cabin, the air inside felt different. Warmer in some places, colder in others, like pockets of uneven temperature. I walked slowly around, checking corners, checking under the bed, checking the back door. Everything looked normal, but my nerves kept tightening. The daylight faded again, and by the time the second night came, the worry in my stomach turned into something close to fear. I lay in the dark again, listening. The woods outside were dead silent. Not even the wind moved. Then the vibrations started again. Stronger this time, not shaking the whole floor, but strong enough that I could feel them through my sleeping bag. A slow, heavy thud somewhere under the cabin. Another thud, then a pause, then another. That's when I realized something important. I didn't remember the cabin having a crawl space. I didn't remember it being raised off the ground at all. I had walked around it earlier and didn't see any gap beneath the walls. The cabin sat directly on the dirt, so whatever I was hearing wasn't under the cabin. It was inside the walls or the floor itself. The heater made a tiny clicking noise as it warmed. The thuds stopped again. I stayed awake for hours. My eyes burned and my body felt stiff, but I didn't dare move. Just before dawn, I heard the final sound. A slow, dragging weight across the floor on the far side of the room. My body turned cold instantly. The sound wasn't outside. There was no mistaking it. It was inside the cabin. Not fast, not loud, just steady and heavy, sliding across the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the ceiling until the first light came through the window. When the sun finally rose, I sat up and looked around. Nothing was moved. Nothing was touched. But the feeling in the air was different. The place felt watched. The silence was thicker than before. I packed everything fast. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't take breaks. I didn't think about anything except getting out. When I stepped outside, I noticed something in the dirt right in front of the cabin door. A long, smooth line, almost like someone had dragged a large object across the ground. It led toward the trees and disappeared into the thick shadows. No footprints, no tire marks, just a long, perfect drag mark. That was enough for me. I carried everything to the car and didn't look back. The whole drive down the dirt path, I felt like something was moving through the woods beside me, keeping pace but staying out of sight. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. Only then did my body finally relax enough for my hands to stop shaking. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked about the noises or the marks in the dirt. I didn't want to know who or what had been moving around inside that old place while I slept. I only knew one thing clearly by the end. Whatever was there with me wasn't something supernatural or impossible. It was something real, something alive, and something that had been comfortable enough to move quietly through that cabin long before I arrived. And once I understood that, the fear stayed with me in a way I can't explain. Because if something real was inside those walls, then it means it can be anywhere, sitting in the dark, waiting for the right moment when no one is paying attention. I left that place behind, but the thought of those slow, heavy movements still sits in my mind every night. I don't think it followed me, but I can't be sure. All I know is that I listened to those sounds for 2 nights, and whatever made them was close enough to touch me if it wanted. The only reason I'm here writing this is because it didn't, and that is the clearest ending I can give. I survived by leaving before I found out what shared that cabin with me. I didn't stay long enough to see its face, and I will never return to give it another chance.